The August heat rose from the Nebraska gravel in visible waves, turning the air thick and difficult to breathe. Caleb Morrison sat in the bed of his grandfather's Ford F-150, his 8-year-old legs dangling over the tailgate, watching his parents load the last of his sister's belongings into their separate cars. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks ago. The paperwork dividing their lives had been signed in a lawyer's office in Lincoln, while Caleb waited in a room with outdated magazines and a fish tank that needed cleaning. Now came the part nobody had explained to him properly. His father stood near the pickup truck, hands in his pockets, looking at everything except Caleb. David Morrison was a tall man who designed buildings in Chicago, a man who wore pressed shirts even on weekends, a man who measured things twice and spoke in careful sentences. He cleared his throat twice before speaking. "Your mother and I have made a decision about what's best for everyone." The words came out rehearsed, like he had practiced them in the mirror. "Lily will go with your mother to Des Moines. I'll be in Chicago for work. And you," his father paused, meeting Caleb's eyes for just a moment before looking away again, "you'll stay here with Grandpa Frank." The heat pressed down. Cicadas screamed in the cottonwood trees. Caleb's mother, Margaret, came around from the other side of the truck. She was a nurse who had worked night shifts at the hospital for as long as Caleb could remember. A woman whose hands were always cold even in summer, who smelled like hand sanitizer and exhaustion. She knelt down in front of Caleb, eye level, and he could see the tiredness in her face that went deeper than missed sleep. "It's just for a while," she said, but her voice had no conviction. "Until we get settled in our new places. You love it here, don't you? You're always happier on the farm than in town." Caleb looked past her at his 5-year-old sister Lily, who sat in their mother's car, clutching a stuffed rabbit, her face pressed against the window, not understanding why her brother wasn't coming with them. He wanted to tell his mother that he didn't love it here, that he had only visited 3 times a year for weekends, that he didn't know anything about farming except that it smelled like manure and made his allergies worse. But something in his mother's face, some desperate need for him to make this easier, stopped the words in his throat. Grandpa Frank stood on the porch of the farmhouse, 70 feet away. Frank Morrison was 68 years old, built like a fence post that had weathered 40 Nebraska winters, silent in the way that men who work alone become silent. He wore the same thing he always wore: faded Wranglers, a blue work shirt with pearl snaps, boots that had been resoled 3 times. He didn't wave, didn't call out, just stood there with one hand on the porch railing, watching his son and daughter-in-law try to explain the unexplainable to a boy too young to understand adult failures. David Morrison pulled out his wallet and handed 3 $20 bills to Caleb. "For anything you need," he said, "I'll send more every month." Then he put his hand on Caleb's shoulder, squeezed once, and walked to his car without looking back. Margaret hugged Caleb tightly, whispered, "I'm sorry," into his hair, and then she too was walking away, getting into her sedan, starting the engine. Caleb stood in the gravel driveway watching both cars pull away in different directions. His father heading east toward the interstate, his mother and sister heading west toward Des Moines. Lily's face was still pressed against the rear window, her mouth open in a cry Caleb couldn't hear over the engine noise. He raised his hand to wave, but the car was already too far away, already turning onto the county road, already disappearing into a future that didn't include him. The silence after they left was total. No more car engines, just wind in the corn that surrounded the farmhouse on 3 sides. The distant lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill pumping water into the stock tank. Caleb stood there with his small duffel bag at his feet, 3 $20 bills crumpled in his fist, trying to understand what had just happened. His parents had taken Lily and left him behind, not temporarily. The word temporary was something adults said when they meant forever but didn't want to admit it yet. Boots on the wooden porch steps. Grandpa Frank walked down slowly, his left knee stiff from an old tractor accident, and stopped a few feet from Caleb. The old man looked down at him for a long moment, his face unreadable, eyes the color of dishwater squinting against the August sun. "Well, boy," he said finally, "looks like it's just you and me now." Caleb wanted to cry, wanted to scream, wanted to run down the gravel road after his mother's car until his legs gave out. But something in his grandfather's tone, flat and matter-of-fact, without pity or comfort, made him swallow all of it down. He picked up his duffel bag. It was lighter than he expected. His mother had packed 3 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, and the paperback book he had been reading about a boy who discovered he was a wizard. Everything else from his room in their old house had been divided up, donated, thrown away. His childhood compressed into one small bag. Grandpa Frank turned and walked back toward the house. No invitation to follow, no reassuring words, just an expectation that Caleb would figure out what to do next. The boy followed, his sneakers loud on the gravel compared to his grandfather's near-silent footfalls. The farmhouse was old, built in 1947 when Frank's father had returned from the war and claimed this section of prairie under the Homestead Act's final iteration. White paint peeled from the clapboard siding. The screen door hung slightly crooked. A barn cat watched from under the porch, yellow eyes tracking Caleb's movement. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and wood smoke, and something else Caleb couldn't name. Something male and spare. The furniture was old but clean. No decorations on the walls except a clock, a calendar from the feed store, and a single photograph of a woman Caleb had never met, his grandmother who died before he was born. Grandpa Frank pointed to the stairs. "Your room's up in the attic. Your dad stayed there when he was a boy. Get settled." Caleb climbed the narrow stairs, his hand on the smooth wooden banister worn pale by decades of use. The attic room had sloped ceilings on both sides, a single bed with a patchwork quilt, a dresser with a mirror that made everything look slightly yellow, and one window that looked out over the cornfields stretching to the horizon. He set his duffel bag on the bed and sat down. The mattress was harder than he was used to. The room was hot, the August afternoon heat trapped under the roof. He opened his bag and took out the 3 changes of clothes, putting them in the dresser drawers that smelled like cedar and mothballs. He put his toothbrush in the bathroom at the end of the hall, a small room with a pedestal sink and a toilet that ran unless you jiggled the handle. He put his book on the nightstand next to the bed. Then he sat down again and looked at his hands. They were soft, unmarked, the hands of a boy who had never done real work. He heard his grandfather moving around downstairs, boots on the wooden floor, the sound of the refrigerator opening and closing. The sun moved across the sky. The room grew hotter. Caleb lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, at the brown water stain in the corner that looked like a map of some unknown country. He thought about Lily in Des Moines, probably in a new bedroom painted pink or yellow, with new toys and new friends waiting at a new school. He thought about his father in a Chicago apartment, surrounded by blueprints and coffee cups, already forgetting what his son's voice sounded like. He thought about his mother working night shifts in a new hospital, too tired to miss him. Nobody had fought for him. That was the part he couldn't stop thinking about. When parents divorced, they fought over who got the children. He had heard stories at school, bitter custody battles, children torn between 2 parents who both wanted them too much. But his parents had agreed instantly, smoothly, that Caleb would go to Grandpa Frank's farm. No argument, no negotiation, just a signature on a line and a drive to Nebraska and a boy standing in a gravel driveway watching his family disappear. Boots on the stairs. Grandpa Frank's head appeared at the top of the attic steps. "Supper," he said, and disappeared back down. The kitchen table was set for 2. A pot of beans sat next to a pan of cornbread and a plate of sliced tomatoes from the garden. Grandpa Frank filled 2 plates without asking what Caleb wanted, set one in front of him, and sat down to eat. He bowed his head for exactly 3 seconds, then picked up his fork. Caleb had never seen anyone pray so briefly. In his mother's house, grace had been a production, hands held, eyes closed, a memorized verse recited in unison. They ate in silence. The beans were good, smoky with bacon, the cornbread sweet and crumbly. Caleb ate half his plate and stopped. Grandpa Frank ate everything, sopped up the last of the bean juice with a piece of cornbread, then looked at Caleb's half-empty plate. "Not hungry or not used to real food?" "Not hungry," Caleb lied. "You'll learn." Frank stood up, carried both plates to the sink. "Farm work builds appetite. We start at 5 tomorrow." "5 in the morning?" Frank looked at him like he had asked if water was wet. "Cows don't care what time you usually wake up. They need feeding at 5, so you'll be up at 5. Caleb wanted to protest, wanted to explain that he was 8 years old, and it was still summer vacation, and he had just been abandoned by his parents, and maybe, just maybe, he deserved one day to adjust before being put to work like a hired hand. But something in his grandfather's face, flat and immovable as a barn wall, told him that protest would accomplish nothing. He went upstairs as the sun set, painting the cornfields gold and orange. He brushed his teeth and put on the pajamas his mother had packed. He lay down in the unfamiliar bed in the unfamiliar room and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of a farmhouse at night, the settling and creaking of old wood, the wind in the eaves, mice in the walls, an owl somewhere close, hunting, the distant howl of a coyote that made his stomach tighten. For the first time since his parents had driven away, Caleb let himself cry. He pressed his face into the pillow so his grandfather wouldn't hear, and he cried for everything he had lost in a single August afternoon. His home, his family, his life. He cried until he couldn't cry anymore, until his chest ached and his eyes burned and exhaustion pulled him down into a sleep full of bad dreams. The knock on his door came while the sky was still black. Caleb opened his eyes to darkness, disoriented, not knowing where he was. The knock came again, harder. Up, his grandfather's voice came through the door. 5 minutes. Caleb fumbled for the lamp switch, wincing at the brightness. 4:45 a.m. according to the alarm clock on the nightstand. He had slept maybe 4 hours. His eyes felt swollen from crying. He pulled on jeans and a t-shirt, found his sneakers, stumbled down the stairs into the kitchen where Grandpa Frank was pouring coffee into a thermos. The old man looked at Caleb's feet and shook his head. Those won't last a day. He opened a closet and pulled out a pair of work boots that were too big, stuffed newspaper in the toes, handed them to Caleb. Wear these until we can get to town for your size. They walked out into the pre-dawn darkness. The air was cool, almost cold, a shocking contrast to yesterday's heat. The eastern horizon showed the faintest gray promise of sunrise. Caleb could barely see where he was walking, stumbling over uneven ground, following the beam of his grandfather's flashlight toward a massive shape in the darkness that resolved into a barn. Inside, Grandpa Frank flipped a switch and fluorescent lights buzzed to life, revealing a concrete floor, metal pens, and 150 black Angus cattle that turned their heads as one to stare at the intruders. The smell hit Caleb like a physical force, manure and hay and animal musk so thick he could taste it. He gagged, pressed his hand over his mouth. You'll get used to it, Frank said, handed Caleb a pair of work gloves that were 3 sizes too big. Start with the hay. That stack there, 2 bales per pen, break them open, spread them in the feed troughs. I'll be back in 20 minutes. Caleb stared at the bales of hay stacked against the far wall. Each bale was held together with 2 strings and weighed at least 50 pounds. There were 12 pens, 24 bales. He was 8 years old and weighed 70 pounds, soaking wet. His grandfather had already disappeared into another section of the barn. He grabbed the first bale by its strings and pulled. It barely moved. He planted his feet and pulled harder, managed to drag it 2 feet before his arms gave out. The cattle watched him with what seemed like judgment. A few of them lowed, the sound echoing off the metal roof. Caleb took a breath through his mouth to avoid the smell, gripped the strings again, and pulled. By the time Grandpa Frank returned, Caleb had moved 4 bales. His arms shook. Blisters were already forming on his palms where the rough string had cut through the 2 large gloves. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cool morning air. Frank surveyed the work without comment, then grabbed a bale in each hand and carried them like they weighed nothing, broke them open, spread the hay in smooth practice motions that took seconds. Watch, he said, and did it again. Slower this time so Caleb could see the technique. Lift with your legs, not your back. Keep the bale close to your body, don't fight it. They worked together in silence as the sun rose, as the darkness outside turned gray, then pink, then gold. Caleb learned to lift with his legs, learned to keep the bale close, learned that fighting the work made it harder. His grandfather said nothing unless giving instruction. No encouragement, no praise, just the work and the expectation that it would be done. After the hay came grain. After the grain came water, checking each tank, making sure the automatic floats were working. After the water came walking the fence line of the nearest pasture, looking for breaks or weak spots where cattle might push through. Caleb's feet hurt in the 2 large boots stuffed with newspaper. His hands hurt where blisters had formed and popped and formed again. His back hurt from lifting. His legs hurt from walking. By the time they returned to the house for breakfast, it was 8:30. Caleb had been awake and working for 3.5 hours. His grandfather made eggs and bacon, strong black coffee for himself and milk for Caleb. They ate in silence. Frank read the newspaper, turned the pages with calm precision, sipped his coffee. Caleb could barely hold his fork, his hands cramping, blisters burning. After breakfast came more work, repairing a section of fence where the wire had rusted through, greasing the fittings on the hay elevator, cleaning the chicken coop and gathering eggs, the hens pecking at his hands when he reached under them, Grandpa Frank showing him how to move with confidence so the birds didn't sense fear. Every task was a lesson. Every lesson was delivered in the fewest words possible. Do it this way, not that way, again. Lunch was sandwiches and lemonade eaten standing up because there was no time to sit. Then back outside into the August heat that had returned with a vengeance, climbing to 95 degrees by 2 p.m. They moved irrigation pipe, 40-foot sections of aluminum that had to be disconnected, drained, carried to the next position, reconnected. Caleb's arms gave out halfway through the first section. The pipe fell, crashing into the corn, flattening 2 rows. Frank looked at the damage, looked at Caleb, said nothing. Just picked up the pipe himself, carried it to position, came back for Caleb, who stood frozen waiting to be yelled at. The old man handed him one end of the next section. Try again. They worked until 6 p.m., 13 hours total with short breaks for meals. Caleb had never been so tired in his life. Every muscle hurt. His hands bled through the bandages Frank had wordlessly applied at lunch. His face was sunburned despite the cap his grandfather had given him. When they finally walked back to the house, Caleb could barely climb the porch steps. Supper was pot roast and potatoes and carrots, all cooked in one pot, simple and filling. Caleb ate mechanically, too tired to taste. His grandfather ate slowly, looking at nothing, the silence between them enormous. After supper, Frank washed the dishes. Caleb dried with a towel, dropping a plate once, catching it before it hit the floor, his grandfather not even looking over. Tomorrow we fix the barn roof, Frank said, putting the last dish away. Section over the hayloft is leaking. Need to get it done before the fall rains start. We'll start at 5. He walked to his bedroom and shut the door. No good night. No acknowledgement that Caleb had worked harder than he had ever worked in his life. Just the expectation of more tomorrow. Caleb climbed the stairs to his attic room, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at his hands in the lamplight. The blisters had torn open and bled and were starting to scab over. His palms were red and swollen. These were no longer the soft hands of a boy who played video games and read books. These were hands that had touched work, real work, and been marked by it. He thought about his sister Lily, probably already asleep in a comfortable bed in Des Moines, tucked in by their mother who had time to read bedtime stories because she wasn't working until her body gave out. He thought about his father in Chicago, probably at a nice restaurant with colleagues, talking about architecture and design. His son, a distant thought, if a thought at all. Caleb had believed the abandonment was about him, that he wasn't good enough, wasn't wanted enough, wasn't worth fighting for. But lying in bed that first night, too tired to cry, too tired even to read his book, he began to suspect something else, some other reason he couldn't quite name yet. His grandfather had agreed to take him with no hesitation, had put him to work immediately, teaching him things boys in the suburbs never learn, had treated him not like a burden, but like someone with potential to be useful. He thought about the way Frank had handed him the 2 large boots without comment, the way he had shown him how to lift hay bales, how to move with the work instead of against it, the way he said try again after Caleb dropped the irrigation pipe instead of yelling. These were not the actions of a man stuck with an unwanted child. These were the actions of a man with a plan. But what plan? What use was an 8-year-old boy to a 68-year-old farmer who had worked this land alone for 40 years? Caleb didn't have answers, only questions and aching muscles and hands that hurt too much to make a fist. He turned off the lamp and lay in darkness, listening to the house settle, to the corn rustling in the night wind, to the distant sound of his grandfather's television through the floor. A baseball game turned low. Tomorrow would come early. Tomorrow would bring more work, more pain, more lessons delivered in silence. Tomorrow he would have to prove he could do it again. He closed his eyes and drifted toward sleep, his last conscious thought a question he couldn't answer yet. Why did Grandpa Frank ask for me? The days became a week, the week became two. Caleb learned the rhythms of the farm, the endless cycle of work that changed with the seasons but never stopped. He learned which cows were aggressive and which were gentle. He learned the sound a tractor made when the timing was off. He learned to read the sky for rain, to smell moisture in the air hours before the first drops fell. His hands toughened, calluses forming over the blisters. His arms grew stronger, able to lift bales that had defeated him that first morning. His legs learned to walk miles without complaining. Grandpa Frank rarely spoke more than necessary, but Caleb learned to read him anyway. A grunt meant approval. A headshake meant try differently. A hand on the shoulder, brief and rough, meant good work though the words were never said aloud. This was a language of action and expectation, foreign to a boy raised on verbal praise and gold star stickers. But Caleb learned it the way he learned everything else on the farm, through repetition and attention and the slow accumulation of small understandings. 3 weeks after his parents had driven away, Caleb was helping his grandfather sort cattle when he noticed a metal box bolted to the wall of the barn office, a small room off the main building that held a desk, a filing cabinet, and stacks of feed store catalogs. The box had a combination lock. It looked old, military issue, out of place among the farm equipment, catalogs, and veterinary supply invoices. "What's in there?" Caleb asked, the first question he had asked in days that wasn't directly about work. "Papers," Frank said. "Important things." "Like what?" "Like things that aren't your concern yet." Yet. The word hung in the dusty air of the barn office, promising future relevance. Caleb wanted to ask more, but his grandfather had already turned away, moving on to the next task. The moment closed. But the box stayed in Caleb's mind. Important papers. Not his concern yet. Yet. The fourth week, Caleb's mother called. The phone rang during supper, and Grandpa Frank answered, listened, then handed the receiver to Caleb without comment. Margaret Morrison's voice sounded distant, not just in miles, but in connection, like she was calling from a different world entirely. "How are you, sweetie? You doing okay out there?" Caleb looked at his grandfather, who had returned to eating, paying no attention to the conversation. "I'm fine. Are you making friends? Have you been to town at all?" "Not yet." "Well, we'll come visit soon. Maybe in a few weeks when we get settled. Lily asks about you every day. She misses you." Caleb said nothing. If Lily missed him so much, why hadn't she been allowed to stay? Why had the choice been so easy? "Your father sends his love. He's very busy with work, but he thinks about you. We both do." "Okay." A long pause. His mother searching for something to say. Some bridge across the distance that had opened between them. "I love you, Caleb. You know that, right? This was the best thing for everyone. You understand that?" "Sure," Caleb said, because it was easier than the truth. "I need to go. Grandpa needs help with something." "Oh, okay. Well, we'll call again soon. Be good." She hung up. Caleb stood holding the receiver, listening to the dial tone, then set it back in the cradle. Grandpa Frank was watching him now. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. "She doing all right?" "I guess. And your sister?" "She's fine." Frank nodded, returned to his meal. They finished eating in silence. Neither of them mentioned the call again. But something had shifted. Caleb had heard the false brightness in his mother's voice. The way she had asked questions without really wanting answers. The way she had ended the call too quickly when he gave her an excuse. His parents had made their choice. They were building new lives that had Caleb-shaped holes in them, spaces they would fill with work and new routines, and the slow forgetting that comes when someone is absent long enough. That night, Caleb couldn't sleep. The August heat had broken finally, a cool front moving through, the first hint of autumn in the air. He got up, intending to get water from the bathroom, but the house was dark and he took a wrong turn, ended up at the top of the stairs looking down into the living room where a single lamp burned. His grandfather sat in an armchair, reading glasses perched on his nose, going through a stack of papers. Caleb started to turn back, not wanting to intrude, but something about the papers caught his eye. They looked official, legal-sized. His grandfather set one aside and Caleb saw a letterhead he recognized. His father's law firm in Chicago. Frank picked up another document, read it slowly, his lips moving slightly, then set it on a different stack. The floorboard creaked under Caleb's foot. His grandfather looked up, saw him standing there in the shadows at the top of the stairs. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Frank took off his reading glasses, rubbed his eyes. "Can't sleep?" "No, sir." "Come here." Caleb walked down the stairs, his heart beating faster. He expected to be sent back to bed, maybe scolded for spying. Instead, his grandfather gestured to the couch across from his chair. Sit. Caleb sat. The papers were spread across the coffee table between them. Forms and documents and what looked like bank statements. Frank gathered them into a neat stack, tapped them square, set them aside. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at Caleb for a long moment, his face unreadable in the lamplight. Your parents think they abandoned you here. The words were blunt, delivered without softness. Maybe you think that too. Caleb said nothing, but his throat tightened. That's not what happened. Frank leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his weathered hands clasped together. I asked for you, told your father after the divorce that you should come here, told him I'd take care of everything, the money, the schooling, all of it. He didn't want to, neither did your mother. They argued with me for 2 months. Why? Because they thought I was too old, thought farming was too hard for a boy your age, thought you needed a normal childhood in town with other kids. But I convinced them. How? Frank was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. I told them the truth, that boys your age need to learn how to work, how to be useful, how to build something with their own hands. The suburbs teach kids how to consume, how to want things, how to measure themselves by what they own. The farm teaches different lessons. Caleb's hands were shaking slightly. He pressed them against his thighs. So you wanted me here? I did. Why me and not Lily? Because Lily's 5 and she needs her mother. And because when I saw you last Christmas, I saw something. The way you watched me work, the questions you asked about the equipment, the way you weren't afraid to get your hands dirty. Some boys are born for this life and some aren't. You were, Omar. Caleb felt something crack open in his chest, some hard shell he had built around his heart over the past month. I thought they didn't want me. Maybe they didn't. Not the way they should have. Frank's voice was hard but not unkind. But I did, and I still do. This farm needs someone to carry it forward. I'm 68 years old. I got maybe 10, 15 good years left if I'm lucky. Someone needs to learn how to run this place. Someone who understands what it means to tend land, to build something that lasts. That someone is you. The old man stood up, gathered his papers, turned toward his bedroom. Then he stopped, looked back at Caleb still sitting on the couch. Tomorrow we start teaching you the money side, how the farm makes profit, what crops bring what prices, how to read market reports. You're old enough now. Questions? Caleb had 1,000 questions about his parents, about the future, about why his grandfather believed in him when his own mother and father had not. But only one came out. Do they know? Mom and Dad, do they know you asked for me? Frank nodded slowly. They know. Don't think it makes them feel good about it, but they know. He walked to his bedroom and closed the door. Caleb sat alone in the living room, the lamp casting shadows that moved when the wind shook the windows. Everything he had believed about the past month was wrong. He hadn't been abandoned. He had been chosen. His grandfather, this stern, silent man who worked from before dawn to after dark, had looked at an 8-year-old boy and seen potential, had fought for him when his own parents had been ready to let him go. The question now was why? What had Grandpa Frank seen that Caleb couldn't see in himself? What future was the old man building toward with such patience and such faith? Caleb climbed the stairs to his attic room and lay in bed, watching moonlight paint silver rectangles on the floor. Outside, the corn whispered secrets to the wind. The cattle shifted and settled in the barn. An owl called once, twice, hunting in the darkness. This farm, this land, these 800 acres of Nebraska prairie had chosen him somehow. Or his grandfather had chosen him for it, which amounted to the same thing. Tomorrow would bring more work, more lessons, more calluses and aching muscles, and the slow building of something Caleb was only beginning to understand. But tonight, for the first time since his parents had driven away, leaving dust clouds on the gravel road, Caleb felt something other than abandonment. He felt purpose. He felt necessary. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he belonged exactly where he was. He closed his eyes and slept without dreams, without tears, the sleep of someone who had worked hard and would work hard again tomorrow. The sleep of someone becoming something new in the quiet darkness of rural Nebraska. The sleep of a boy learning to be a man in the only way that had ever really mattered. Through work, through patience, through the slow earning of trust from someone who gave it rarely but meant it absolutely when he did. The farm waited. The land waited. And Caleb, 8 years old with calloused hands and a grandfather's faith resting heavy on his shoulders, waited too for the future to reveal itself one hard lesson at a time. The Nebraska winter came early that year, arriving in November with a north wind that turned the remaining corn stalks brittle and gray. Caleb was 9 years old now, taller by 2 inches, his shoulders broader from months of lifting and carrying. The soft suburban boy who had arrived in August was gone, replaced by someone who could work alongside his grandfather without complaint, who woke before the alarm clock, who no longer flinched at the smell of the cattle barn. School had started in September, a 45-minute bus ride each way to a consolidated district that served 5 rural communities. Caleb sat alone near the front, his backpack smelling like hay despite his best efforts to keep it clean. The other children lived in town or on small acreages, not working farms. They talked about television shows Caleb had never seen, video games he had no time to play, weekend trips to Omaha or Kansas City that might as well have been foreign countries for all the chance he had of visiting them. At lunch, he sat with 2 other farm kids, boys whose fathers raised hogs or chickens, boys who understood why Caleb's hands were calloused and his jeans were stained and his eyes were always tired. They didn't talk much. Farming wasn't something you discussed. It was something you endured and took pride in enduring. A quiet competition of who could handle the most work with the least complaint. But even among the farm kids, Caleb was different. Their fathers had hired hands, modern equipment, diversified income from crop insurance and government subsidies. Grandpa Frank ran his operation alone, with machinery that dated back to the 70s, with a stubborn refusal to accept help or handouts or anything that smelled like charity. The old man believed in work and land and the unbreakable contract between them. Everything else was commentary. The first real snow came in December, 4 inches overnight that turned the farm into a black and white photograph. Caleb learned to break ice on the water tanks with a sledgehammer, the impact jolting up his arms, the cattle pressing close for their turn to drink. He learned to drive the old Ford tractor with chains on the tires, pushing snow away from the barn doors, from the feed storage, from the driveway that connected the farm to the county road 2 miles away. Christmas morning, they worked until 9, then came inside for a breakfast of pancakes and sausage. Grandpa Frank handed Caleb a wrapped package, newspaper and masking tape. No bow or ribbon. Inside was a Carhartt jacket, brown duck canvas, sized for a boy but built to last. Real work clothes, not a toy or a game or something that would be forgotten in a month. Clothes that expected him to grow into them, to wear them until they were stained and worn and prove their worth. "Thank you," Caleb said, running his hand over the stiff fabric. "You'll need it." Frank sipped his coffee, looking out the window at the white fields. Getting colder from here until March. They ate in comfortable silence. No Christmas music, no decorations except a small plastic tree on the television that Frank had owned since 1975. The same tree he put up every year. The same ornaments arranged in the same pattern. This was Christmas on a working farm. Acknowledge the day, then get back to the business of staying alive until spring. Caleb's mother called at noon. She sounded happy, or trying to sound happy, her voice too bright. Lily sang Jingle Bells into the phone, off-key and enthusiastic. His father got on the line briefly, asked how school was going, told Caleb to work hard and listen to his grandfather. The call lasted 7 minutes. When it ended, Caleb felt relief more than sadness. The distance between his old life and his new one had grown too wide for a phone call to bridge. He was becoming someone his parents wouldn't recognize, someone shaped by early mornings and hard work and a grandfather's patient faith. January brought temperatures that dropped to 15 below zero. The diesel fuel in the tractor gelled despite the additive Frank mixed in each fill-up. They worked in layers, thermal underwear and flannel, and the Carhartt jacket and insulated coveralls, looking like shapeless bundles moving through the frozen landscape. Caleb's face went numb within minutes of stepping outside. His fingers ached in his gloves, but the work didn't stop for cold. The cattle needed hay, the water tanks needed ice broken twice daily, the equipment needed maintenance in the unheated machine shed where their breath came out in clouds and metal burned skin if you touched it without gloves. Frank taught him diesel engine repair that winter. The two of them bent over the exposed motor of the old John Deere, working by trouble light, their hands black with grease. "This is the fuel pump," Frank would say, pointing with a wrench. "This is the ejector. This is what fails first when you don't maintain it proper." Caleb learned to read the engine by sound, the healthy rhythm of combustion versus the knock of bad timing, or the wheeze of a clogged fuel filter. These were lessons no school taught, knowledge passed down through demonstration and repetition, the same way farmers had taught their sons for 100 generations. February brought a thaw and then a freeze that coated everything in ice. Tree branches snapped under the weight. Power lines came down. The farm lost electricity for 3 days. They cooked on the wood stove in the living room, a cast iron monster that had been there since the house was built. They read by kerosene lamp. They went to bed when it got dark and rose when it got light, living like people had lived before electricity, before convenience, when the rhythm of farm life was dictated entirely by sun and season and the needs of animals who didn't care if the power was out. On the third night without electricity, Caleb sat by the wood stove reading a book about the Dust Bowl, farm families driven off their land by drought and wind and economic collapse. Grandpa Frank sat across from him, sharpening a knife on a whetstone, the steady scrape, scrape, scrape of steel on stone, in meditation. "You understand why we do things the old way now?" Frank asked without looking up from his work. Caleb thought about it. "Because the old way still works when the new way fails?" Frank nodded. "Grid goes down, we're fine. We got wood for heat, propane for cooking, a well with a hand pump in the basement. Bank crashes, we got food in the freezer, and cattle we can sell for cash. Everything modern is built on the assumption that nothing will ever go wrong. But things go wrong all the time. The old ways assume disaster and plan accordingly." The power came back on the next morning, the lights flickering to life, the refrigerator humming, the television crackling with static before finding a signal. But something had changed in those 3 dark days. Caleb had seen how the farm could sustain itself, how it could function independent of the grid that connected the rest of America. The isolation he had felt in August, the sense of being cut off from the real world, now felt like insulation, protection. The farm wasn't disconnected, it was self-contained. There was a difference. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, the snow melting into mud that turned the feedlot into a sucking morass. Caleb learned to walk in muck boots, high-stepping through ankle-deep slop, moving cattle from winter pens to pasture that was finally greening up. He learned to repair fence damaged by winter, replacing rotted posts, restringing barbed wire, the cold metal cutting through his gloves when he wasn't careful. In April, Frank brought him to the machine shed and pointed to a small tractor, a Farmall Cub from 1952, painted red and white, old but maintained with obvious care. "Your father learned to drive on this. Now you will." Caleb climbed into the metal seat, his feet barely reaching the pedals. Frank stood beside him, talking him through the controls. Clutch, throttle, gear shift. The engine turned over on the third try, settling into a rough idle. Frank showed him how to ease out the clutch, how to give it gas without flooding it, how to feel the engagement point where the tractor began to move. They spent 2 weeks practicing in an empty field, Caleb driving in straight lines, learning to turn, to back up, to judge distance and speed and the bite of the plow against soil. Frank sat on the fender, saying little, correcting only when necessary. When Caleb finally managed to plow a quarter-acre without stopping or stalling or wandering off his line, his grandfather climbed down and inspected the work. The furrows were crooked in places, uneven in depth, but they were furrows. Work had been done. "Good enough," Frank said. "Tomorrow we do the South 40 for real." The South 40 acres were designated for soybeans that year. Caleb drove the Farmall while Frank followed on the big tractor with the disc harrow, breaking up the plowed soil. They worked dawn to dusk, stopping only for quick lunches brought to the field. Caleb's back ached from maintaining position on the hard metal seat. His hands cramped on the steering wheel. But he kept going, kept the tractor moving, kept the rows as straight as his limited skill allowed. On the third day, he made a mistake. Trying to turn at the end of a row, he swung too wide and plowed into a section that was supposed to stay fallow. 50 feet of wasted work, soil torn up, that would now need to be reseeded with grass. Frank shut down his tractor and walked over, looked at the damage, looked at Caleb, who sat frozen in the driver's seat. waiting for anger or punishment or disappointment. "You'll fix it," Frank said. "Tonight after supper, reseat it with the broadcast spreader. Tomorrow you'll remember to turn earlier." That was all. No lecture, no yelling, just the consequence and the expectation that Caleb would correct his error. That night, working alone in the fading light, spreading grass seed over the torn earth, Caleb understood something about his grandfather's teaching method. Mistakes weren't shameful. They were expensive lessons. You paid for them with extra work, with time, with effort. But they taught you more than success ever could. May brought planting season in earnest. The weather turned warm and humid, the soil reaching the right temperature and moisture content for corn. They worked 18-hour days, Frank on the big 8-row planter, Caleb running seed and fertilizer from the farm to the field in the pickup truck, keeping the planter's hoppers full. The timing had to be perfect. Plant too early and a late frost killed the seedlings. Plant too late and the corn didn't mature before the first fall freeze. There was a 2-week window and they used every daylight hour of it. Caleb learned to read the seed monitors, to watch for skips where a seed failed to drop, to adjust the depth wheels for changing soil conditions. He learned the mathematics of farming, calculating acres planted against bags of seed used, projecting yield based on spacing and variety, and historical data from previous seasons. Frank kept records going back 40 years, notebooks filled with cramped handwriting, rainfall totals and planting dates and harvest weights. History compressed into numbers. The story of the farm told in bushels per acre, and profit margins measured in pennies. The first thunderstorm came in early June, a massive system that rolled across the plains with lightning that turned night into day and thunder that shook the farmhouse on its foundation. Caleb watched from his attic window as the rain came horizontal, driven by 60-mile-per-hour winds, flooding the fields, bending the young corn stalks nearly flat. The storm lasted 3 hours. When it passed, they walked the fields at first light, inspecting for damage. Most of the corn had survived, resilient in the way that growing things are resilient, straightening themselves toward the sun as if nothing had happened. But one section of 20 acres planted in a low spot with poor drainage was underwater. The seedlings were drowned, and dying, a total loss. Frank stood at the edge of the flooded field, hands in his pockets, face showing nothing. "Can we replant?" Caleb asked. "Too late. Seasons moved on. This section's done for the year." 20 acres at projected yield was 3,600 bushels of corn. At $2.20 per bushel, that was $7,920. Caleb had learned to do this math automatically now. $7,000 lost to a single storm. "Nature doesn't negotiate," Frank said, turning back toward the truck. "Some years she gives, some years she takes. You accept both with the same level of emotion, which is none at all. Getting upset doesn't change anything." That summer, Caleb turned 10. There was no party, no cake, no celebration beyond Frank making his favorite meal, fried chicken and mashed potatoes and corn on the cob from their own field. His mother sent a card with a $50 bill inside and a note saying she wished she could be there. His father called and talked for 3 minutes before claiming he had a meeting to attend. Lily got on the phone and asked when Caleb was coming to visit, and he had no answer because the farm didn't pause for visits, didn't stop for anything except the rhythm of the seasons and the needs of the land. The summer heat climbed into the 90s and stayed there through July and August. They irrigated constantly, moving pipe, checking water pressure, watching the corn grow from knee-high to over their heads, the field rustling with the sound of a million leaves catching the wind. Caleb worked shirtless now, his skin brown from sun, his body lean and hard from constant labor. At night, he fell into bed too tired to dream, too tired to think about anything except the work waiting for him when the sun came up again. In late August, Frank took him to the farm office, a room Caleb had only entered a handful of times. The old man opened a filing cabinet and pulled out folders, spread them across the desk. "Time you learned the money side." For the next 2 hours, Frank walked him through the farm's finances. Income from crop sales, expenses for seed and fertilizer and diesel and equipment repairs, property taxes, insurance. Caleb saw numbers that shocked him. The farm grossed over $400,000 in a good year, but after expenses, the profit was closer to $80,000. Everything else went back into the operation, into maintenance and improvements, and the slow accumulation of equipment that would last decades if properly cared for. We're not rich, Frank said, but we own this land free and clear. 800 acres with no mortgage. That's worth more than money in the bank. Caleb looked at the papers, at the careful accounting that went back years. Then he saw something that made his stomach clench. A folder labeled First National Bank. Inside were loan documents. A mortgage dated 1995 for $320,000. But you just said we own it free and clear. Frank was quiet for a moment. I lied. Or I spoke aspirationally. The original 800 acres are paid off, but in '95 I bought 400 acres adjacent to our north property line. Took a mortgage to do it, 15-year note. Caleb did the math. That was 4 years ago. 11 years left on the loan. How much do we still owe? Frank opened another folder. Folder showed him the most recent statement, $267,000. The number felt impossibly large. What's the monthly payment? $29.60. Plus taxes and insurance, call it $4,200 a month. What happens if we can't pay? Then the bank takes the land, all of it, not just the 400 acres I mortgaged. That's how these things work. You secure a loan with everything you own. Have we ever missed a payment? Never, and we won't. But you need to understand what's at stake here. One bad year, maybe we survive. 2 bad years back to back, we're in trouble. 3 bad years and we lose everything. Caleb felt cold despite the August heat. Why did you borrow so much? Because good land doesn't come available often. When the Henderson place went up for sale, I had to move fast. 400 acres adjoining our property, good soil already fenced. I couldn't let that opportunity pass. But the risk, Frank closed the folders, put them back in the filing cabinet. Everything worthwhile involves risk. The question is whether you're taking smart risks or stupid ones. This was smart. The land will pay for itself over time. But you need to know it's not guaranteed. Nothing in farming is. That night, Caleb lay awake thinking about the $267,000 hanging over the farm like a storm cloud that never quite broke into rain. His grandfather was 69 years old. If something happened to him, if he got sick or injured or died, what would happen to the farm? Who would make those $4,200 monthly payments? Who would do the work? The answer, though unspoken, was obvious. Caleb would. That was the plan. That was why Frank had asked for him, had taught him, had been patient with his mistakes and generous with his knowledge. The old man was building a successor, someone who could take over when the time came. The weight of that responsibility should have terrified a 10-year-old boy. Instead, it felt like purpose, like meaning, like the opposite of the abandonment he had felt that first August day. School started again in September. Caleb was in 5th grade now, taller than most of his classmates, stronger, more serious. He had no interest in the social dynamics of elementary school, the petty dramas and shifting alliances. He showed up, did his work, got straight A's without trying particularly hard. Math was easy when you spent your summers calculating yield and profit margins. Science was easy when you'd watch seeds become plants, become crops. English was pointless except for the reading, which he did voraciously, working through the farm's small library of agricultural textbooks and almanacs and weather journals. The other kids thought he was weird. Fine. He thought they were soft, mutual incomprehension that required no resolution. He had one friend, a boy named Tommy, whose grandfather raised wheat 2 counties over. They sat together at lunch and talked about equipment and crop prices and whether the winter would be mild or brutal. Conversations their fathers and grandfathers had been having for generations. An unbroken chain of agricultural knowledge passed down through demonstration and necessity. October brought harvest, the corn was ready, the moisture content dropping to the sweet spot where the kernels were dry enough to store but not so dry they shattered when the combine ran them through. Frank rented a combine for 2 weeks, an expensive investment but necessary. The old man couldn't run the machine himself anymore. His reflexes not quite quick enough, his back not strong enough to handle the vibration in the long hours. He hired a custom harvester, a taciturn man named Earl who showed up with a massive John Deere combine that cost more than the farm made in 3 years. Caleb rode in the grain cart tractor, pulling alongside the combine in the field, matching Earl's speed while the harvested corn flowed into the cart in a golden cascade. When the cart was full, he drove to the grain bins and unloaded, watching the level rise. Tangible proof of a year's work compressed into kernels of corn that would be sold as livestock feed or processed into ethanol or any of a dozen other uses he didn't think much about. What mattered was the weight, the bushels, the market price that would determine whether this year was profitable or just survivable. They harvested for 12 days straight, dawn to well past dark, stopping only when dew made the corn too wet to run through the combine. Caleb learned to operate by feel, to judge when the cart was full without looking at the gauge, to anticipate when Earl would need him to pull alongside. By the end of the 12 days, he could have operated the grain cart in his sleep, muscle memory taking over, his body moving through the motions while his mind drifted. The final tally came in at 143,000 bushels. At the current market price of $2.35 per bushel, that was $336,000 gross. Minus the $65,000 in expenses for the year, they netted $271,000, enough to make the mortgage payments with plenty left over. A good year. Not exceptional, but solid. The farm would survive another 12 months. Frank wrote the check to the bank, his handwriting shaky but legible. 1 year down, he said, 10 more to go. November brought the first hard freeze and the beginning of the quiet season. Maintenance and repair and preparation for winter. Caleb spent more time in the machine shed, learning to weld, to fabricate parts that were no longer manufactured for equipment old enough to vote. He learned to read the farm supply catalogs, to compare prices, to order strategically when dealers ran sales. He learned that a $5 part replaced now could prevent a $500 repair later, that maintenance was never wasted money. The winter of 1999 to 2000 was mild by Nebraska standards. The snow came light and melted fast. The temperatures stayed mostly above zero. It was a gift, less stress on the cattle, less fuel burned for heat, less wear and tear on equipment. Frank seemed almost relaxed, as much as the old man ever relaxed, taking time to teach Caleb things beyond the immediate necessity of farm work. They read market reports together, tracking corn and soybean futures, understanding how weather in Brazil or political decisions in Washington could affect the price a Nebraska farmer got for his crops. They studied soil science, learning about nitrogen levels and pH balance, and the complex ecosystem of microorganisms that turn dirt into productive farmland. They planned crop rotation for the coming years, balancing nutrient depletion with market prices with equipment capabilities. Caleb was 11 years old and thinking like a business owner, not because he was precocious, but because the farm demanded it. This wasn't a hobby or a lifestyle choice. It was an economic engine that required constant attention, constant adjustment, constant learning. The margin between success and failure was too thin for ignorance or complacency. In March, just before spring planting, Frank sat Caleb down at the kitchen table with a serious expression. "Need to talk to you about something." Caleb felt his stomach tighten. The old man's tone suggested bad news. "I'm getting old. 70 next month. Body doesn't work like it used to. Had some chest pains last week, went to see Doc Miller. He says my heart's getting tired. Nothing critical yet, but it's a warning. Are you okay?" "For now, but we need to plan for the possibility that I won't be. If something happens to me, you need to know where everything is. The will, the insurance policies, the deed to the land, who to call, how to keep things running." "You're not dying." Frank smiled, a rare expression that made him look younger. "Not planning on it, but life doesn't consult our plans. You're 11 years old, too young legally to own property or make binding contracts. If I died tomorrow, your father becomes executor of my estate. He'll sell the farm, take the money, probably put it in a trust for you until you're 18. By then, the land will belong to someone else. So what do? We make sure I don't die for at least 7 more years. Get you to 18. By then, you'll be old enough to decide your own future. In the meantime, I teach you everything I know. Make sure you're ready. What if you get sick? What if you can't work? Then you work double." Frank's voice was matter of fact. "You're strong enough now, smart enough. You can run this operation if you have to. Won't be easy, but nothing worthwhile is." Caleb looked at his grandfather's weathered face, at the liver spots on his hands, at the slight tremor that had developed in his left hand over the winter. 70 years old, a tired heart, the weight of 800 mortgaged acres and a vision of succession that required Frank to stay healthy for 7 more years. The mathematics of it felt fragile, precarious. like building a house on a foundation that could crack at any moment. But what choice did they have? The farm didn't stop. The seasons didn't wait. The bank still wanted its monthly payment regardless of who was making it. All they could do was work and hope and plan for contingencies that might never come, but probably would, because life had a way of demolishing even the most careful plans. Spring came, and with it the familiar rhythm of planting. Caleb was bigger now, able to handle more responsibility, taking over tasks that had been his grandfather's domain. Frank supervised more than worked, pointing out problems, making suggestions, but letting Caleb make most of the decisions, training through delegation, building confidence through responsibility. The crop went in perfect that year, every seed in the ground during the optimal window, the weather cooperating with warm days and gentle rains. By the time school let out for summer, the corn was up and growing strong, the soybeans emerging in neat rows, the farm looking like a textbook example of agricultural success. But Caleb had learned enough to know that looking good in June meant nothing. The real test came in August, when the heat arrived and the rain stopped, and you found out whether your irrigation system could handle the demand or whether nature would take your plans and turn them to dust. That was still months away. For now, they worked and watched and waited. Three occupations that defined farming more than any amount of modern technology or agricultural science ever could. On his 11th birthday in June, Caleb's mother called to say she and Lily might come visit in July, maybe stay a weekend, spend some time together. Caleb said that would be nice, knowing it wouldn't happen. They would find reasons: work obligations, summer camps, car trouble. The excuses didn't matter. The distance between them had grown too great to cross with a single weekend visit. They lived in different worlds now, spoke different languages. His mother talked about shopping malls and movies. Caleb talked about commodity prices and soil moisture. They had nothing in common except biology and history, and neither was enough to bridge the gap. He hung up the phone and went back outside where his grandfather was working on the irrigation pump. The old man's hands black with grease, his face creased with concentration. Caleb picked up a wrench and knelt beside him, ready to help, ready to learn, ready for whatever came next. This was his family now, this land, this work, this patient old man who had chosen him and taught him and believed in him when no one else had. The summer heat built through July. The corn grew tall, taller than Caleb, the leaves rustling with a sound like distant applause. The cattle grazed in pastures that stayed green thanks to careful water management. The machinery ran smoothly thanks to constant maintenance. Everything was working. Everything was right, which meant something was about to go wrong, because that was how farming worked. You never relaxed, never assumed, never stopped watching the horizon for the next disaster. It came in August. The heat came in the first week of August and never left. 102 degrees on the Monday, 105 on Tuesday. By Friday, the thermometer outside the kitchen window read 108, and the forecast showed no relief in sight. The corn that had looked so promising in June began to curl its leaves inward, a defense mechanism against moisture loss that signaled the beginning of stress. The soybeans turned a dusty gray-green, their pods small and underdeveloped. The pasture grass went dormant, turning brown despite the irrigation they ran 18 hours a day. Caleb was 11 years old, and he watched his grandfather's face grow tighter with each passing day of heat. They worked in the pre-dawn hours when the temperature was merely 90, moving irrigation pipe, checking water pressure, inspecting the crops for signs of pest infestation that always followed drought stress. By 8 in the morning, it was too hot to work outside safely. They retreated to the machine shed, where the temperature was only slightly cooler, making repairs, organizing parts, anything to stay productive while the sun baked the moisture from the soil. The weatherman on the evening news spoke in careful neutral tones about a high-pressure system that showed no signs of moving, about jet stream patterns that were keeping rain systems away from the Great Plains, about historical precedents from 1936 and 1908 when drought had devastated the Heartland. He used words like unprecedented and emergency and relief funds, words that Frank listened to with his jaw clenched and his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. On the 14th consecutive day without rain, they walked the cornfields at sunset when the heat had dropped to merely intolerable. Caleb followed his grandfather down the rows, watching the old man stop every 20 feet to examine a plant, to dig into the soil with his pocket knife, to shake his head at what he found. The soil was powder 6 inches down. The roots were stressed, unable to take up nutrients even when irrigation provided water, because the ground temperature was too high. The ears that should have been filling out with kernels were small, stunted, many of them aborted entirely by plants trying to survive rather than reproduce. "We're going to lose 40%, Frank said finally, maybe 50 if this keeps up another 2 weeks. Caleb did the math automatically now, a reflex developed over 3 years of living on the farm. They had 1,200 acres in corn. Expected yield was 180 bushels per acre. 50% loss meant losing 90 bushels per acre across 1,200 acres. That was 108,000 bushels. At the current price of $2.40 per bushel, they were looking at a $259,000 loss. Against a projected gross income of $500,000, that left them with barely enough to cover expenses, let alone make the mortgage payment. "What do we do?" Caleb asked. Frank looked at the western horizon where the sun was setting red and angry through the heat haze. "We keep irrigating, we keep hoping, and we start planning for the worst." That night, Caleb lay in his attic room with all the windows open and no breeze coming through, sweat soaking his sheets, and he thought about what the worst meant. Losing the farm, moving to town, his grandfather working some minimum wage job at 70 years old, Caleb going back to his father or mother, whichever one would take him, returning to a life he no longer fit into. The thought made his chest tight with something close to panic. He got up, went downstairs for water, found his grandfather sitting at the kitchen table with the farm ledgers open, the green desk lamp casting shadows across the old man's face. Frank looked up, unsurprised. "Can't sleep in this heat," he said. "Might as well be productive." Caleb sat down across from him. "How bad is it really?" Frank turned the ledger around so Caleb could see the numbers. "Worse than I let on in the field. We need $280,000 to cover expenses and the mortgage for the year. Best case scenario now, we bring in maybe $300,000 gross. After costs, we might clear $30,000. That's not enough. We'll have to dip into savings to make the payment." "How much savings do we have?" "About $80,000. Emergency fund I've been building for 30 years. If we use half of it this year and the drought breaks, we'll be okay. But if next year is bad too, we're finished. So we need next year to be good." Frank closed the ledger. "We need next year to be average. Good would be nice. Great would let us rebuild the savings. But average would keep us alive. The problem is, droughts don't usually last just 1 year. They come in cycles. 2 years, 3 years, sometimes longer. The Dust Bowl lasted most of a decade." Caleb looked at his grandfather's hands, spotted with age, trembling slightly as they always did now in moments of stress. "So what's the plan?" "We survive this year. We learn from it. We figure out how to be more resilient. And we pray that whoever's in charge of the weather takes pity on Nebraska farmers." The drought continued through August. The irrigation system ran constantly, draining the wells, and still it wasn't enough. The corn yield estimates dropped from 50% loss to 60%. Some of the soybeans simply died in the field, not worth the diesel fuel it would take to harvest them. The cattle lost weight because the pasture provided no nutrition, forcing Frank to buy hay at inflated prices from farmers in South Dakota who had gotten rain. School started in September, and Caleb returned to 6th grade, having aged a decade in a single summer. He sat in classes, learning about fractions and state capitals in the Revolutionary War, information that seemed abstractly irrelevant compared to commodity prices and rainfall totals and the slow mathematics of financial disaster. His teacher asked if everything was okay at home. He said it was fine because what else could he say? That his family's survival depended on weather patterns beyond anyone's control? That he went home each day to a grandfather who was aging rapidly under the stress of watching 40 years of work threatened by an act of nature? The first rain came on September 20th, a gentle soaking rain that lasted 2 days and was 3 months too late to save the crops, but early enough to replenish the soil moisture for winter wheat. Frank stood on the porch watching it fall, his face showing nothing, and Caleb knew the old man was calculating whether they could afford to plant wheat this year, whether the risk of seed and fertilizer costs was worth the potential return 6 months down the road. The harvest was brutal. The combine ran for 5 days instead of the usual 12. The yield came in at 78 bushels per acre instead of 180, the worst in the farm's recorded history. The grain bins that should have been full sat mostly empty, their capacity a mocking reminder of what might have been. Frank wrote a check for $60,000 from savings to make up the shortfall between income and expenses. Neither of them spoke about what it meant. October brought cooler temperatures and the kind of perfect farming weather that would have been useful 3 months earlier. They planted winter wheat in the fields that had been designated for it, a gamble that next year would be better, that the investment would pay off. Frank moved slowly now, his energy diminished, his chest pains more frequent, though he tried to hide them. Caleb took over more of the physical work, running the tractor, moving equipment, doing the jobs that required stamina rather than experience. Winter came early that year, snow in November, temperatures dropping below zero in December. They burned through propane heating the house, the cost adding up, everything adding up. Caleb kept the farm books now, entering expenses and income in the ledger his grandfather had maintained for 40 years, seeing the numbers turn red, watching the savings account dwindle. By Christmas, they were down to $50,000 in reserve. One more bad year, and they would have nothing left between them and foreclosure. On Christmas morning, they opened no presents. Frank made breakfast, and they ate in silence, the farm quiet under a foot of snow, the world reduced to survival. Caleb's mother called, and he spoke to her for 3 minutes, answering her questions with yes and no, unable to explain the weight he carried, the responsibility that had been placed on shoulders still too narrow for it. When Lily got on the phone singing Christmas carols, Caleb excused himself, said he had chores to do, hung up while his sister was still singing. Frank found him in the barn an hour later, sitting on a hay bale, not crying but close to it. "It's too much," Caleb said. "I'm 12 years old. I can't save the farm." Frank sat down beside him, the hay bale creaking under their combined weight. "You're not supposed to save it alone. That's my job. Your job is to learn, to be ready for when it becomes your responsibility for real. What if we lose it before then? What if next year is bad too? Then we lose it." Frank's voice was matter of fact. "And we figure out what comes next. But we don't lose it because we gave up. We don't lose it because we stopped fighting. We lose it because sometimes nature is stronger than human will, and there's no shame in that." Caleb looked at his grandfather's profile, the sharp nose and deep-set eyes and the wrinkles that mapped a lifetime of hard work and hard choices. "You're not scared?" "Terrified. Been terrified since August. But fear doesn't change anything. Work does, planning does. So we work and we plan and we hope that the odds turn in our favor eventually because they have to. The universe can't hate farmers forever." The winter was long and brutal. They burned through more savings on heating costs and cattle feed and equipment repairs that couldn't be delayed. By March, the emergency fund was down to $38,000. They had enough for one more mortgage payment after this year's crops came in, and if those crops failed, they were done. The mathematics were clear and unforgiving. Spring came reluctantly, cold and wet, the ground staying too soggy to work for weeks. They missed the optimal planting window for corn, finally getting seed in the ground in early May, when the calendar said it was already late. Frank's hands shook constantly now, the tremor no longer something he could hide. Doc Miller had increased his heart medication and told him to reduce stress, advice so absurd given their circumstances that Frank had laughed in the doctor's face. Caleb was 13 years old and running the planting operation almost entirely on his own. Frank rode in the passenger seat of the tractor, making suggestions, catching errors before they became expensive. But the physical work was beyond him now. The old man looked frail, diminished, a shadow of the stern figure who had met Caleb on the porch 5 years ago. The transformation was terrifying to watch. The crop went in the ground 3 weeks late. The weather stayed cool and wet, the seedlings growing slowly, and Caleb found himself praying to a God he wasn't sure he believed in for just one thing: an average summer. Not great, not perfect, just average. 80-degree days and regular rain and no disasters. That was all they needed to survive. June brought heat but also rain, the combination ideal for growing corn. The plants shot up, vibrant green, healthy, reaching for the sky. The soybeans filled in their rows, the canopy closing, choking out weeds. By the 4th of July, the farm looked better than it had in 2 years. Frank walked the fields with Caleb, moving carefully, his breathing labored, but his eyes showed something that had been absent for months: hope. Might make it, he said, kneeling to examine a corn plant, running his weathered hand along the stalk. This might actually work. July was perfect. Warm days, cool nights, rain twice a week like clockwork. The corn tasseled right on schedule. The soybeans set pods. The cattle fattened on pasture that stayed green and lush. Every morning, Caleb woke expecting the other shoe to drop, the inevitable disaster. But day after day brought good news, ideal conditions, the kind of summer that farmers dreamed about but rarely experienced. August came and the corn began to fill out, the ears heavy with kernels. They walked the fields taking random samples, shelling out corn by hand, counting kernels per row, doing the math. The yield projections climbed from 100 bushels per acre to 140 to 160. By mid-August, they were projecting 170 bushels per acre, a number that would save them, that would rebuild the savings, that would buy them time to recover from last year's disaster. Frank stood in the cornfield on a morning when the temperature was perfect and the sky was blue and the crop rustled with health and abundance, and Caleb saw tears in the old man's eyes for the first time ever. "We're going to make it," Frank said quietly. "One more month and we're going to make it." But the universe, as Frank had noted, sometimes hated farmers. On August 20th, with 3 weeks to go before harvest, a hailstorm rolled across the Great Plains. The Weather Service had predicted thunderstorms, normal for late summer, nothing to worry about. What they hadn't predicted was the size of the hail, stones the size of golf balls falling from a sky gone green and violent, driven by winds that flattened corn stalks and shredded soybean leaves and turned a perfect crop into a disaster in the span of 20 minutes. Caleb and Frank huddled in the basement while the storm raged overhead, listening to the impact of ice on the farmhouse roof, the sound like continuous gunfire, and they both knew without speaking what was happening to the crops in the field. When the storm passed and they emerged into an afternoon gone eerily quiet, the damage was total. The corn was flattened, stalks broken, ears knocked off or damaged beyond use. The soybeans were stripped to stems, all the leaves and pods torn away. The hail had accumulated in drifts 3 feet deep in places, white against the green of the wrecked crops, beautiful and terrible. They walked through the destruction in silence. There was nothing to say. 5 years of work, 3 years of Caleb's childhood spent learning this trade, building toward this moment, all of it erased in less time than it took to eat lunch. The math was simple and final. With no crop to harvest, they had no income. With no income, they couldn't make the mortgage payment. With no mortgage payment, the bank would foreclose. The farm was gone. Frank stood in the middle of a cornfield that looked like a war zone, and he didn't cry, didn't shout, didn't show anything except a deep weariness that made him look older than his 70 years. Then he sat down in the mud, right there in the middle of the destruction, and Caleb sat beside him, and they watched the sun set over the wreckage of their future. The next morning, Caleb woke before dawn as always, went downstairs, and found his grandfather already at the kitchen table with the phone book open. The old man looked up, his face gray with exhaustion. "I've been thinking all night. There might be a way." Caleb sat down, afraid to hope. "What way?" "We sell the cattle, all of them. Top price right now for beef. We've got 150 head, average weight 1,200 pounds. We can clear maybe 70,000 after the hauling and sales costs. That's not enough for the mortgage." "No, but it's a start. Then we sell every piece of equipment we don't absolutely need. The old tractors we keep for backup, the extra implements, the grain cart, maybe another 30,000. Still not enough." Frank's hands were trembling badly now. "Then we sell half the land, 600 acres. Keep the home place and the best fields. Use that money to pay off the mortgage on what's left." Caleb felt like he'd been punched. "Sell the land you've spent your whole life building? The land we'll lose entirely if we don't. This way we keep something. We stay here. We start over smaller. It's not what I wanted, but it's better than nothing." "What about the 400 acres you bought? The ones that are mortgaged? Those go first. We sell those to pay down the loan. Then we sell 200 more to clear it completely. We'll end up with 600 acres free and clear. It's enough to farm, enough to survive." Caleb understood the logic, but he also understood what it meant. 40 years of accumulation, of careful growth, of building something substantial, All of it reduced by half because of 20 minutes of hail. The unfairness of it burned in his chest. There has to be another way. There isn't. I've been farming for 50 years, boy. I know when I'm beat. Frank stood up, his movement slow and careful. Now we make the best of it. We call the livestock auction, list the equipment, contact a real estate agent. We do what needs doing. They spent September liquidating. The cattle sold for good prices, beef demand high, and brought in $73,000. The equipment sold piecemeal through farm auctions and classifieds. Another $28,000. The land was harder. Finding a buyer who could close quickly and pay cash proved difficult. The real estate agent suggested owner financing, but Frank refused. They needed the money now, not payments over time. October brought a buyer, a corporate farming operation out of Iowa looking to expand. They offered $600,000 for the mortgage 400 acres plus 200 acres of the original farm. The offer was 20% below market value, but it was cash and it was immediate. Frank accepted it. The closing was scheduled for November 1st. Caleb watched all of this with a growing sense of despair. The farm that had been 1,200 acres was being reduced to 600. The herd that had been 150 head was gone. The equipment that had filled the machine shed now sat in the lots of other farmers who had bought it cheap. Everything was being diminished, reduced, lost. School became unbearable. Word had spread about the Morrison farm's troubles, the small-town gossip network efficient and merciless. Other farm kids looked at Caleb with a mixture of pity and superiority, their operations having survived the drought and the hail. Town kids who had never understood him to begin with now saw him as a failure, a cautionary tale about the dying relevance of family farms in an age of corporate agriculture. He started getting into fights. Small provocations that he would have ignored a year ago now resulted in thrown punches and trips to the principal's office. Frank was called in twice to discuss Caleb's behavior. The old man sat through the lectures from school administrators with the same patient silence he brought to everything, then told Caleb on the drive home that fighting wouldn't change anything. Feels better than doing nothing, Caleb said. Does it? Frank glanced at him. Or does it just give you something to focus on besides what you can't control? Caleb had no answer. They drove the rest of the way home in silence. The land sale closed on November 1st as scheduled. Frank deposited the $600,000 check and immediately wrote a check to First National Bank for $298,000, paying off the mortgage in full. The remaining $300,000 went into savings. It was a substantial amount of money, more than most families would see in a lifetime. But Caleb knew it represented loss more than wealth. Those dollars were the quantified value of 400 acres of Morrison family land that now belonged to strangers. That evening, November 2nd, Caleb came home from school to find Frank's truck still parked in front of the house at 4 in the afternoon. The old man was never inside during daylight hours unless he was sick. Caleb's stomach clenched with worry as he pushed through the front door. "Grandpa?" Silence. Then a sound from the living room, a thump like something heavy falling. Caleb ran. Frank was on the floor between the couch and the coffee table. His body twisted at an unnatural angle, his face slack on the left side, his eyes open but not focusing. Drool ran from the corner of his mouth. His right hand clutched at his chest, fingers curled like claws. "Grandpa!" Caleb dropped to his knees beside him, his hands shaking. "Can you hear me?" Frank's mouth moved, but no words came out, just a garbled sound that might have been trying to form Caleb's name. His left arm lay useless at his side. The left side of his face drooped like melted wax. Stroke. The word exploded in Caleb's mind with terrible clarity. He had watched a training video in health class just 2 weeks ago. Face drooping, arm weakness, speech difficulty. Time to call 911. He scrambled for the phone on the side table, his hands shaking so badly he could barely dial. The emergency operator answered on the second ring. 911, what's your emergency? My grandfather. I think he's having a stroke. He's on the floor. He can't talk right. His face is drooping. Is he conscious? Yes. His eyes are open, but he can't move his left side. What's the address? Caleb rattled off the farm's rural route number, added directions because he knew the ambulance would never find them otherwise. Quarter mile past the Henderson place, white farmhouse, Morrison on the mailbox. How old is he? 70. He has heart problems. Takes medication. Is he breathing? Caleb looked at Frank's chest, saw it rising and falling. Yes, but it looks hard, like it hurts. Okay, stay with him. The ambulance is on the way. Don't try to move him. If he stops breathing, you'll need to start CPR. Do you know how? I learned it in school. Good. Keep him comfortable. Talk to him. Let him know help is coming. We're going to stay on the line until the paramedics arrive. Caleb knelt beside his grandfather, the phone pressed to his ear with one hand, his other hand gripping Frank's good hand. The old man's fingers were cold, his grip weak but present. His eyes found Caleb's face and something passed between them, some wordless communication that needed no speech. It's okay, Caleb said, his voice breaking. Help is coming. You're going to be okay. Frank's mouth moved again, that same garbled sound, and Caleb understood he was trying to say sorry. Sorry for being weak. Sorry for adding this burden. Sorry for everything. Don't, Caleb said. Don't apologize. Just hold on. The 20 minutes until the ambulance arrived felt like 20 hours. Caleb stayed on the floor with his grandfather, talking to him about nothing and everything, about the cattle they had sold and the equipment that had gone to good homes and the 600 acres they still had. He told Frank about the fight he had gotten into at school with Tommy Jensen, who had said the Morrison farm was finished. He told him about the math test he had aced without studying because farm accounting made algebra look simple. Frank's eyes never left Caleb's face. The old man couldn't speak, couldn't move half his body, but he could listen. And Caleb talked, filling the silence with words because silence meant thinking about what was happening, about losing the only person who had ever truly believed in him. When the paramedics finally arrived, they moved with efficient speed, checking vitals, asking questions Caleb answered as best he could. Yes, he has heart disease. Yes, he takes medication. The bottles are in the bathroom cabinet. No, I don't know exactly when it happened. I found him like this when I got home from school. They loaded Frank onto a stretcher, started an IV, placed an oxygen mask over his face. One of the paramedics, a woman with kind eyes, put her hand on Caleb's shoulder. You did everything right. Getting help fast makes all the difference with strokes. You might have saved his life. Caleb rode in the ambulance, holding his grandfather's hand, watching the monitors beep and flash with numbers he didn't understand. Frank's eyes were closed now, his breathing steadier but still labored. The left side of his face remained slack, lifeless, a visible marker of how quickly everything could change. At the hospital, they wheeled Frank into the emergency room, and Caleb was left in the waiting area with forms to fill out. Insurance information, medical history, next of kin. He wrote his father's name and number for next of kin, then crossed it out and wrote his own name. He was 13 years old and probably not legally qualified to make medical decisions, but he was here and David Morrison was in Chicago, and the doctors needed answers now. They admitted Frank to the ICU. The neurologist, a tired-looking man in his 50s, explained that Frank had suffered an ischemic stroke, a blood clot in the left side of his brain. They had administered clot-busting drugs, but the damage was already done. The next 72 hours would be critical. If Frank survived, he would need months of rehabilitation. He might regain some function, he might not. Can I see him? Not yet. We need to stabilize him first. You should call your family. Let them know what's happened. Caleb called his father from the hospital payphone. David answered on the fourth ring, distracted, probably in the middle of a work meeting. Caleb, is everything okay? Grandpa had a stroke. He's in the hospital. It's bad. A long pause. How bad? They don't know yet, but he can't move his left side, can't talk. The doctor said the next 3 days are critical. Another pause, longer this time. I'll get on a plane. Should be there by tomorrow morning. Are you alone? Yeah. Jesus. Okay, stay at the hospital. I'll call your mother. Have her come too. We'll figure this out. The phone went dead. Caleb hung up and walked back to the waiting area, sat in a plastic chair that was bolted to the floor and waited. Other families came and went, dealing with their own emergencies. A man with a broken arm, a child with a fever, an elderly woman who had fallen and might have broken her hip. The machinery of crisis and treatment grinding on indifferent to individual suffering. At midnight, they let Caleb into the ICU for 5 minutes. Frank lay in a hospital bed surrounded by machines, tubes running into his arms, monitors tracking his heart and blood oxygen. His eyes were closed. The left side of his face still drooped. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by illness and fear. Caleb stood beside the bed and took his grandfather's hand. I'm here, he said. I'm not going anywhere. Frank's eyes opened slowly, found Caleb's face. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His right hand squeezed Caleb's fingers weakly. You're going to get better. Caleb said, not knowing if it was true, needing to believe it anyway. And when you do, we're going to work that 600 acres and make it better than the 1,200 ever was. We're going to prove everyone wrong. We're going to survive. A tear ran down Frank's right cheek, the first time Caleb had ever seen his grandfather cry. The old man's mouth moved again, forming words his damaged brain couldn't voice. But Caleb understood anyway. Thank you. I'm proud of you. Don't give up. The nurse came and said visiting hours were over. Caleb left the ICU and found his father in the waiting room, having caught an earlier flight than expected. David looked out of place in his suit and tie, a city person in a rural hospital, uncomfortable and uncertain. They hugged awkwardly. David asked questions Caleb answered. The doctors came and explained the situation again, using medical terms that meant Frank's recovery would be fragile and difficult and might never be complete. David nodded, asked about costs and insurance, practical questions that needed asking. Margaret arrived in the morning with Lily. They visited Frank together, the family reunited by crisis. And Caleb saw his mother's face crumble when she saw the strong old man reduced to this. Frank had been her father-in-law for 20 years, a difficult relationship, but a real one. And seeing him broken affected her more than she had expected. Frank survived the 72 hours, then a week, then 2 weeks. Slowly and possibly he began to recover. The left side of his face regained some movement. His speech returned, slurred and difficult but comprehensible. His left arm remained mostly useless, but his left leg responded to physical therapy. 3 weeks after the stroke, they transferred him to a rehabilitation facility. Caleb visited every day after school, watching his grandfather work through exercises that would have been simple before and were now monumental achievements. Lifting a cup, forming a sentence, walking 10 feet with a walker. Frank's frustration was evident, but so was his determination. The stroke had stolen his body, but not his will. On a cold evening in mid-December, Frank was released from rehabilitation with instructions for home care and outpatient therapy. David had returned to Chicago after the first week. Margaret had stayed longer, but eventually went back to Des Moines. Caleb was alone again with his grandfather, but now the old man needed help with everything. Dressing, bathing, eating. The role reversal was complete. The teacher had become the student. The strong had become the weak. That night, after helping Frank to bed, Caleb sat in the farm office looking at the ledgers. Someone needed to manage the operation, and that someone was him. 13 years old and responsible for 600 acres, for making decisions that would determine whether they survived or lost what little remained. He thought about the past 5 years, the work and the loss and the constant threat of disaster. He thought about the drought that had nearly broken them and the hail that had forced them to sell half the farm. He thought about finding Frank on the floor, watching the stroke steal the old man's strength in real time. And he thought about what Frank had said in the basement during the hailstorm, that sometimes you lose because nature is stronger than human will, and there's no shame in that. But you don't give up. You don't stop fighting. You work and you plan and you hope that eventually the odds turn in your favor. Caleb opened a fresh page in the ledger and began planning for spring planting. 600 acres, smaller operation, lower costs, more manageable. They would survive this the same way they had survived everything else, one day at a time, one decision at a time, one season at a time. The farm waited, the land waited, and Caleb, 13 years old with calloused hands and a grandfather recovering from a stroke and 600 acres of responsibility resting on his shoulders, waited too for the future to reveal itself one hard lesson at a time. Outside the window, the first snow of December fell softly across the fields they had kept, covering the land in white, erasing the scars of last summer, preparing the ground for whatever came next. The land endured, the farm persisted, and so would they. High school was 4 years of being a stranger in a familiar place. Caleb Morrison walked the halls of Lincoln County High, carrying textbooks he barely needed to open, earning grades that came effortlessly because calculus was simpler than crop yield projections, and chemistry was easier than understanding soil pH and nutrient uptake. The other students talked about college applications and weekend parties and who was dating whom. Conversations that felt like they were happening in a foreign language Caleb had never bothered to learn. He was 15, 16, 17, 18, growing taller and broader, his hands permanently stained despite scrubbing, his face weathered beyond his years. Girls looked at him sometimes with curiosity, drawn to something they couldn't quite name. The self-sufficiency, maybe, or the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly who he was and what he wanted. But when they got close enough to smell the diesel and hay that no amount of washing completely removed, when they understood that Friday nights meant equipment maintenance and Saturday mornings started at 5 regardless of the season, their interest evaporated like morning dew in August. There was one exception. Her name was Rachel Hartman, and she was the daughter of Joe Hartman, the farmer who had helped Caleb save that corn crop years ago when his inexperience had nearly destroyed it. Rachel had grown up on a farm 3 miles east, understood the rhythms of agricultural life, didn't flinch at calloused hands or early mornings or the particular loneliness that came from loving land more than most people loved anything. They met at the county fair in the summer between Caleb's junior and senior year. She was working the 4-H booth, demonstrating butter churning to children who had never seen a cow up close. Caleb stopped to watch, drawn by the patient way she explained where food came from, the connection between soil and table that most people had forgotten or never known. When she looked up and caught him staring, she smiled and held his gaze without looking away, a directness he wasn't used to. "You gonna stand there all day, or are you going to try it?" Caleb stepped forward, took the churn handle she offered, worked it with the easy rhythm of someone who had done similar tasks 1,000 times. The butter formed in minutes. Rachel raised an eyebrow, impressed despite herself. "Farm kid," she said. "It wasn't a question. Morrison place, west of town. I know it. My dad speaks highly of your grandfather, says he's old school in the best way." "He is that." Caleb paused, searching for words. "Though he's not doing much work anymore. After the stroke." Rachel's expression shifted. Sympathy without pity. "I heard about that. How's he doing?" "Better. Slower. Learning to accept help, which is harder for him than the physical therapy." "And you're running the place?" "Mostly. We had to sell half the land after the hail, down to 600 acres now." Rachel nodded, no judgment in her face. "A lot of farms didn't survive that storm. The fact you kept any of it says something." They talked for 20 minutes, the longest conversation Caleb had with someone his own age in years. Rachel was 17, planning to study agricultural engineering at Iowa State, wanted to come back and help modernize her family's operation. She spoke about precision farming and GPS-guided equipment and soil sensors with the kind of enthusiasm most girls reserve for fashion or celebrity gossip. But what struck Caleb most was the way she challenged him, questioned his assumptions about traditional farming methods, pushed back when he dismissed new technology as unnecessary expense. "You can't just do things the way your grandfather did and expect to compete," she said, her eyes bright with conviction. "The farms that survive are the ones that adapt. Precision agriculture isn't about replacing experience. It's about enhancing it with data. Data can't tell you how the land feels. No, but it can tell you soil moisture at 6-inch depth across every acre. Can your grandfather's experience do that?" Caleb found himself grinning despite his initial defensiveness. Fair point. When he asked if she wanted to get coffee sometime, she looked at him appraisingly. "Depends. Are you going to spend the whole time telling me why old ways are better? Or are you willing to actually listen?" "I'll listen if you will." "Deal." She wrote her number on a 4-H pamphlet. "Call me when you're ready to have your mind changed about technology." They started seeing each other in the careful way of farm kids who had responsibilities that came before romance. Sunday afternoons when the essential work was done, late evenings in summer when the days stretched long, they would sit on the tailgate of Caleb's truck overlooking the fields and argue about everything from crop rotation to climate change to the economics of farming in an age of corporate consolidation. Rachel never just agreed with him to keep the peace. When Caleb said government subsidies undermine market forces, she countered that without crop insurance, small farms would have disappeared decades ago. When he insisted that GPS-guided tractors were a waste of money, she pulled out her phone and showed him data from her father's farm. Yield increases of 15% with the same inputs, just from more precise application. "You're impossible," Caleb said once after she had demolished his argument about organic farming being impractical at scale. "And you're stubborn. But you're also smart enough to change your mind when the evidence is against you. I like that." Their first real disagreement came in the spring of Caleb's senior year. Rachel had been accepted to Iowa State with a scholarship, full ride for agricultural engineering. She was leaving in August for orientation. Caleb had no plans beyond the farm, no interest in college, couldn't imagine leaving Frank, who was still recovering, still needed help. You could take online classes, Rachel suggested one evening. Study agricultural business, maybe some engineering. You don't have to go to campus. Why would I study what I already know? Because what you know is one farm's experience over 3 generations. What you could learn is how farming works globally, how markets function, what technologies are emerging. She turned to face him directly. You're brilliant at this, Caleb, but you're limiting yourself to what's right here. There's more out there. I don't want more. I want this. What if this isn't enough? The question hung between them, sharp and uncomfortable. Caleb wanted to be angry, but he knew she was asking out of concern, not judgment. Rachel believed in him in a way that was different from Frank's belief. His grandfather had faith in Caleb's work ethic and commitment. Rachel had faith in his potential to be more than just a good farmer, to be an exceptional one. I'll think about it, he said finally. That's all I'm asking. Frank approved of Rachel without saying so explicitly. His approval evident in the way he made himself scarce when she visited, the way he asked about her family's operation with genuine interest, the way he once mentioned that Joe Hartman's daughter seemed like good people. For the old man, that qualified as enthusiastic endorsement. But what Frank didn't say, what Caleb sensed anyway, was gratitude. Rachel was pushing Caleb to think bigger, to prepare for a future beyond just maintaining what existed. That push was something Frank could no longer provide. By Caleb's 18th birthday, Frank had regained perhaps 70% of his function. He could walk without a walker, though his gait was uneven. His speech was mostly clear, though he sometimes struggled to find words. His left arm remained weak but usable. He could drive short distances, could help with light work, could be present without being the primary operator. The transformation from vigorous 70-year-old to diminished 75-year-old had happened in the span of 3 years, compressed by crisis into what felt like decades of aging. On a cold November morning in Caleb's senior year, he found Frank sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers and a pen, his hands shaking as he tried to write. The old man looked up, his face gray. "Need you to witness something," he said. "Are you okay? Should I call the doctor?" "I'm fine." "Or I'm not fine, but a doctor can't fix it." Frank pushed the papers across the table. "This is my will, updated version. I'm leaving everything to you. The land, the equipment, the money, all of it. But there's a condition." Caleb sat down, his heart beating faster. "What condition?" "You can't sell the land for 10 years. Not an acre of it. If you do, everything reverts to the Nebraska Agricultural Land Trust. They'll turn it into a conservation easement and you'll get nothing." "Why?" "Because I need to know you're committed, that you won't get an offer from some corporate farm and cash out the day I'm dead. 10 years is long enough to prove you mean it when you say you want this life." "I do mean it." "Then you'll have no problem with the condition." Frank pushed the will forward again. "Sign as witness. The lawyer already notarized it, but I want you to see what's in here. No surprises after I'm gone." Caleb read through the document, the legal language dense but the meaning clear. Everything to Caleb Morrison upon the death of Frank Morrison. 600 acres of farmland in Lancaster County, Nebraska. All farm equipment and vehicles. All bank accounts and investments. Estimated total value $3.2 million. The number shocked him. He knew the land was valuable, but seeing it quantified, seeing the accumulated wealth his grandfather had built through 50 years of careful farming, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "There's more," Frank said quietly. Turn to page 4. Caleb flipped pages and found a second property listing. 1,200 acres in Gage County, Nebraska, owned by Morrison Farmland LLC, a company Caleb had never heard of. Current value approximately $4.8 million. "What is this?" "Land I bought in 2008, right after we sold off half the farm. Paid cash, $350 an acre when everyone thought agriculture was dying and land was worthless. Put it in a separate company so it wouldn't show on the main farm's books. Been renting it out to a neighbor down there, making about $60,000 a year in lease income." "You bought 1,200 acres and never told me?" "Wanted to see if you'd stay without knowing about it. Wanted to make sure you were choosing the farm for the right reasons, not because you knew there was more money waiting." Frank leaned back in his chair, his breathing labored. "You passed the test. 7 years of hard work after the stroke, never complaining, never asking what you'd inherit. That's how I knew you were ready." Caleb felt something crack in his chest, emotion welling up that he forced back down through years of practice control. Why tell me now? Because I'm dying. Don't look at me like that. It's just fact. Heart's giving out. Doc Miller says I got maybe 6 months if I'm lucky. I wanted you to know what's coming, what you'll be managing when I'm gone. 6 months. The words seemed impossible. Frank had been a constant for Caleb's entire adolescence, the foundation on which everything else was built. The thought of losing him, of facing the farm alone, created a hollow ache in Caleb's stomach. What do I do? Caleb asked. Same thing you've been doing. Run the farm, make good decisions. Don't overextend. Find someone you trust to share the load with. Frank's eyes moved to the window where Rachel's truck was pulling into the driveway. Someone like that, maybe. Rachel and Caleb married the summer after graduation in a small ceremony at the Lutheran church in town. 50 people attended, mostly farming families, who understood why the reception was held at 2 in the afternoon, early enough that everyone could get home for evening chores. There was no honeymoon. They spent their wedding night in the farmhouse, Caleb's childhood home, starting their married life the same way they would continue it, working the land together. Rachel had deferred her enrollment at Iowa State, decided to take a gap year to help Caleb transition into full ownership. She insisted it wasn't a sacrifice, that she was learning more from hands-on work than she would in a classroom. But Caleb knew better. She was giving up her scholarship year, her chance to start the degree program she had dreamed about. For him, for them, for the farm that was becoming theirs. You don't have to do this, he told her one evening as they worked on updating the farm's record-keeping system on her laptop. I know, she looked at him with those direct eyes that had first caught his attention at the county fair. But I want to. Your grandfather's dying, Caleb. You're about to inherit a massive responsibility. You need someone who understands what that means. And I'm not giving up on college. I'm just postponing it a year. What if you end up resenting me? Then I'll tell you, and we'll figure it out. But I don't make decisions I'll regret. Neither should you. She squeezed his hand. We're partners now. Everything we build together. Frank had declined visibly by then, barely able to walk from his bedroom to the kitchen, spending most of his time in a hospital bed they had set up in the living room. Doc Miller came by twice a week, adjusting medications, preparing them for the inevitable. The old man was 87 years old and had outlived his own expectations by 6 months. He was ready. On a Sunday morning in late November, Caleb was working in the machine shed when Rachel came running, her face pale. Frank had asked for him. By the time Caleb reached the living room, his grandfather's breathing had changed, become shallow and irregular. The old man's eyes were open but unfocused, looking at something beyond the ceiling. Caleb took his hand, the skin papery thin, the bones prominent. I'm here, Grandpa. Frank's eyes focused, found Caleb's face. Did good, he whispered. Better than I hoped. You'll be fine. I don't know if I can do this without you. Been doing it for 2 years already. Just kept checking with me to be polite. Frank's mouth moved in what might have been a smile. Proud of you. Tell your dad I'm sorry I was hard on him. He wasn't wrong to leave, just wasn't built for this like you are. I'll tell him. The land, Frank said, his voice fading. Take care of it. It'll take care of you. Those were his last words. His breathing slowed, paused, stopped. Caleb sat holding his grandfather's hand as the morning light came through the window, as the farm continued its endless work outside, indifferent to human grief. Rachel stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, and they stayed that way until Doc Miller arrived an hour later to pronounce what they already knew. The funeral was held on a cold December day, with snow threatening but not yet falling. 200 people came, farmers and townspeople and relatives Caleb barely knew. His father, David, flew in from Chicago, looking uncomfortable in his expensive suit, out of place among the Carhartts and work boots. His mother, Margaret, came from Des Moines with Lily, who was 20 now and studying marketing at the university, a young woman Caleb hardly recognized. They buried Frank in the family plot next to Caleb's grandmother and Uncle James. The son who had died 30 years ago in a tractor accident. The preacher spoke about a life of hard work and faithful stewardship, about a man who had loved the land and passed that love to the next generation. Caleb stood at the graveside, dry-eyed and silent, his grief too deep for public display, locked inside where it would stay until he could process it alone. Rachel stood beside him, her hand in his, a steady presence that kept him anchored. The reading of the will happened 2 days later in the office of Thompson and Associates, the law firm that had handled Frank's affairs for 40 years. The conference room held Caleb and Rachel, David and Margaret, Lily, and two of Frank's siblings who had driven in from Iowa. Attorney Thomas Thompson, 80 years old and sharp as ever, opened a folder and began to read. I, Frank Morrison, being of sound mind and body, do hereby make this my last will and testament. The legal preamble took 5 minutes. Then Thompson got to the distribution of assets, and the room changed, tension crackling like electricity before a storm. To my son, David Morrison, I leave my regrets that farming did not call to him as it called to me, and my understanding that a man must follow his own path. I leave him no monetary inheritance, as he has built a successful career independent of this farm and needs nothing from me. David's face went red. Nothing after everything? Thompson continued reading as if there had been no interruption. To my granddaughter, Lily Morrison, I leave my hope that she finds happiness in whatever life she chooses, and my thanks for the boy she brought to an old man's final years. I leave her no monetary inheritance, as her path lies far from agriculture, and this farm would be a burden rather than a blessing. Lily looked at Caleb with something like pity or maybe relief. To my grandson, Caleb Morrison, I leave everything else. The home place consisting of 600 acres in Lancaster County, Nebraska, all buildings, equipment, and improvements thereon. All bank accounts, stocks, bonds, and financial instruments held in my name. Estimated total value $3.2 million. Margaret gasped. David stood up. This is insane. You can't leave everything to one person. There's more, Thompson said mildly. Please sit down. David sat, his jaw clenched. Additionally, I leave to Caleb Morrison all assets held by Morrison Farmland, LLC, a company I established in 2008. This includes 1,200 acres in Gage County, Nebraska, currently leased for agricultural use. Estimated value $4.8 million. The room erupted, David shouting about unfairness and undue influence, Margaret crying, Lily trying to calm them both down. Thompson let it continue for 30 seconds, then rapped his knuckles on the table. If you'll allow me to finish, there are conditions attached to this inheritance that you should know about. The room quieted. Rachel's hand tightened on Caleb's, her presence grounding him. He noticed she hadn't reacted at all to the numbers, had simply sat quietly listening, as if she had already known, or as if the money didn't matter as much as the land itself. Thompson continued. Condition 1. Caleb Morrison may not sell, transfer, or encumber any of the inherited land for a period of 10 years from the date of my death. If he attempts to do so, all assets will be forfeit to the Nebraska Agricultural Land Trust. What kind of ridiculous condition is that? David demanded. The kind Frank Morrison chose to include in his legally binding will, Thompson replied. Condition 2. The land must remain in active agricultural production during those 10 years. It cannot be subdivided for development or converted to non-agricultural use. He's trapping you, David said to Caleb. Don't you see he's forcing you to stay here, to waste your life on this farm? Caleb spoke for the first time since the reading began, his voice steady. It's not a waste if it's what I want. You're 20 years old. You don't know what you want. I'm 27, and I've known what I want since I was 13 years old. Thompson cleared his throat. There's one final section you should hear. A letter Frank asked me to read in the event of any contest to this will. He pulled out a handwritten page, Frank's shaky script recognizable even from across the table. Thompson read, To anyone who thinks this distribution is unfair, I offer this explanation. I asked Caleb to come live with me when he was 8 years old. I did not take him because his parents abandoned him. I took him because I saw in him something rare, the capacity to love land more than comfort, to value work over ease, to build something that would outlast him. For 19 years, I taught him everything I knew. He learned it all. He earned every acre, every dollar, every piece of equipment through work and dedication, and a faith in farming that never wavered even when we lost half the farm to drought and hail. My other heirs chose different paths I respect and support, but none of them chose this life. None of them wanted this land, and land should go to those who love it, who will protect it, who will pass it on better than they found it. That person is Caleb. This is not favoritism. This is recognition of commitment. If you cannot understand that, I am sorry, but it does not change my decision. The silence after Thompson finished reading lasted a long time. Then David stood, grabbed his coat, and walked out without another word. Margaret followed him, pausing at the door to look back at Caleb. "I hope you know what you're doing," she said. Lily stayed. She came around the table and hugged Caleb, held him tight. "I'm happy for you," she whispered. "I really am. This is what you want, what you've always wanted. I hope it makes you happy." "It does," Caleb said. "Or it will. Once I figure out what to do with all of it." Rachel spoke up for the first time. "We'll figure it out together." Thompson handed them a thick folder. "Everything you need is in here. Deeds, titles, account information, tax records. You should also know that Frank made his final mortgage payment on the Gage County land last year. Everything is owned free and clear. No debt. You're starting with a clean slate and $8 million in assets." $8 million. Rachel let out a low whistle. "Okay, that's more than I expected. We're going to need to hire an accountant." "Already have one lined up," Thompson said. "Frank recommended someone who specializes in agricultural estates. I can make the introduction." That night, alone in the farmhouse that was now fully theirs, Caleb and Rachel sat at the kitchen table with all the documents spread out, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what they had inherited. "This is terrifying," Caleb admitted. "I thought I was ready, but looking at all of this, the responsibility, the money, the land, I'm 27 years old. How am I supposed to manage $8 million? The same way you managed the farm when your grandfather had his stroke." Rachel's voice was calm, practical. "One decision at a time. We make a plan, we stick to it. We don't do anything stupid or impulsive, and we build on what Frank started." "You keep saying we, because it is we." She leaned forward, holding his gaze. "I married you. That means I'm in this completely. Your inheritance is our inheritance. Your responsibility is our responsibility. We're partners, Caleb, equal partners. So stop looking scared and start looking at this as an opportunity." "An opportunity for what?" "To build something bigger than either of us could build alone. To prove that family farms can not only survive but thrive. To show that there's a different way to do agriculture than corporate consolidation and exploitation." She tapped the papers. "This is capital, land and money. We can leverage it into something that matters." Caleb felt something shift in his chest, fear transforming into something closer to excitement. "You've been thinking about this since the day I met you at the county fair?" She smiled. "I saw a boy who loved farming more than anything. I wanted to see what he could do with real resources behind him. And now we get to find out. The next few months were a blur of paperwork and legal filings and learning to manage assets far more complex than Caleb had imagined. Rachel proved invaluable, her sharp mind and agricultural engineering background, giving her a technical understanding that complemented Caleb's practical knowledge. Together, they developed a plan for the operation going forward. They would continue farming the 600-acre home place as they had been. The crops and methods familiar and proven. The 1,200 acres in Gage County would remain leased for another 3 years, the income providing financial cushion while they learned to manage the larger operation. After that, they would gradually take over direct farming of that land, expanding carefully, never overextending the way Frank had warned against. They hired 2 full-time workers, young men from farming families who wanted to learn the trade. They invested in newer equipment, not the latest models, but reliable machines that would last decades with proper maintenance. And they began implementing the precision farming techniques Rachel had been advocating for years. GPS guidance, soil sensors, variable rate fertilizer application, technology that increased yields while reducing environmental impact. "You were right," Caleb told her one evening as they reviewed the data from the first season using the new systems. "About all of it, the technology, the planning, the systematic approach. We just increased yield by 18% with lower input costs." "I'm always right," Rachel grinned. "You just needed $8 million to figure that out." The farm became more than sustainable. It became prosperous. By the time Caleb turned 30, they were grossing over $1 million a year in crop sales and lease income. The $300,000 Frank had left in savings had grown to $500,000 through careful investment and retained earnings. They had achieved a level of financial security that allowed them to think beyond mere survival, to consider legacy and impact. But prosperity brought its own complications. Word spread in the county about the Morrison farm's success, about the young farmer who had inherited millions and was building something impressive with it. Caleb received offers to sell almost weekly, corporate farming operations, and investment groups willing to pay premium prices for productive farmland near Lincoln. He turned them all down without considering them, the 10-year restriction making the decision easy. His father called occasionally, the conversations awkward and brief. David had never forgiven Frank for the inheritance distribution, couldn't understand why everything had gone to Caleb. He suggested, carefully, that Caleb could share some of the wealth with family who needed it more. Rachel's graduate school wasn't cheap. Lily was working 2 jobs to pay off student loans. Surely Caleb could help. The farm is doing well because we reinvest everything, Caleb explained. We're not sitting on piles of cash. It's all working capital. But you could sell some land, just 100 acres. Pay off Lily's loans. I can't sell any land for 8 more years. Grandpa's will forbids it. After 8 years then. After 8 years, I still won't sell. This land isn't an investment to liquidate when convenient. It's a legacy to maintain. David stopped calling after that conversation. The distance that had opened when Caleb was 8 years old became a chasm. They were family by blood, but strangers by choice. Their lives too different to bridge with occasional phone calls and obligatory holiday cards. The isolation didn't bother Caleb the way it might have bothered someone else. He had Rachel, who understood him better than anyone, who pushed him to be better, who shared his vision for what the farm could become. He had the farm itself, which demanded everything and gave back purpose and meaning. He had the memory of his grandfather, the lessons learned over 19 years, the knowledge that he was honoring a legacy that stretched back generations. On a spring evening 3 years after Frank's death, Caleb was cleaning out the attic of the farmhouse, preparing to insulate it properly before the next winter. The space had been used for storage as long as he could remember, boxes and trunks and forgotten furniture covered in dust. In the far corner under a tarp, he found a metal box he didn't recognize. It was military issue, olive drab, secured with a combination lock. Caleb tried Frank's birthday. Nothing. Tried his own birthday. Nothing. On impulse, he tried the date Frank had bought the farm, April 15th, 1965. The lock clicked open. Inside were journals, 20 of them, leather-bound, dated from 1998 to 2017. Caleb opened the first one randomly, saw his grandfather's handwriting, shaky but legible. September 1st, 1998. Caleb's first day. The boy cried last night. I heard him through the floor. But this morning he was up on time, worked without complaining. There's strength in him. Just needs to learn how to access it. Caleb's throat tightened. He called down the stairs. Rachel, can you come up here? She climbed to the attic, saw him surrounded by journals, understood immediately. What did you find? 20 years of Grandpa's thoughts. He kept a journal every day. About me, about the farm, everything. They sat together on the dusty attic floor and read entries at random. April 15, 1999. Taught Caleb to plow today. He drove the old farm all like he'd been doing it for years. Made mistakes but learned from them. Didn't need to tell him twice. This one's a natural. July 8, 2005. Drought is killing us, but Caleb keeps working. 15 years old and putting in 18-hour days trying to save the corn. I can't do this much longer. Thank God he's here. November 12, 2009. Stroke last week. Thought I was done. But Caleb took over without being asked. Ran the whole operation while I was in the hospital. Made some mistakes, but nothing we can't fix. He's ready for this. Maybe been ready for years. Rachel read over his shoulder, her hand on his back. He loved you so much. I know. But reading it, seeing it written down year after year, it makes it real in a different way. June 20th, 2015. Made my will today. Everything to Caleb. David will be angry, but he made his choice 40 years ago. Lily's a sweet girl, but she's not a farmer. Caleb earned this. Every acre, every dollar. I have no regrets. The final entry was dated 3 days before Frank died. November 25th, 2017. Don't have much time left. Heart's failing. But I'm at peace. Caleb is everything I hoped he'd be. Strong, dedicated, smart enough to learn and humble enough to admit what he doesn't know. The farm will be safe with him. Better than safe. It will grow. He'll build something I only dreamed about. I wish I could see it, but knowing it will happen is enough. The land chose well when it chose him, and he chose well when he chose Rachel. She'll push him to be better than he thinks he can be. That's what love does. My only regret is not living long enough to see their children work this land. But I trust Caleb will teach them the same lessons I taught him. work, patience, respect for the land, love that outlasts you. That's the real inheritance. Everything else is just details. Rachel was crying now, reading that final paragraph. He knew. He saw us. He was a smart old man. Caleb closed the journal carefully. And he was right about you. You do push me to be better. Good. She wiped her eyes because we're just getting started. They carried the box downstairs together, placed it in the farm office where Caleb could access it when he needed the reminder, the confirmation that he was walking the path meant for him. Outside, the spring sun was setting over 600 acres of Morrison land, soon to be 1,800 acres when the lease expired and they took over direct farming of the Gage County property. The fields were planted, the equipment was maintained, the future was secure. Caleb stood on the porch where he had stood 20 years ago, watching his parents drive away, where Frank had put a hand on his shoulder and said it was just the two of them now. The old man had been right about that and right about everything else. The land had needed someone to love it. Caleb had needed something to love. The match had been perfect. And Rachel, brilliant, stubborn Rachel, had completed the equation in ways Frank had somehow known she would. The 10-year restriction on selling would expire when Caleb was 37. By then, he would have proven beyond any doubt that his commitment was real, that the inheritance had gone to someone who would honor it. But he already knew the restriction didn't matter. He would never sell. Not in 10 years. Not in 50. This land was his the way a child belongs to a parent, a connection deeper than ownership, a responsibility that transcended profit or convenience. The sun dropped below the horizon, painting the sky orange and purple. The first stars appeared. Somewhere in the fields, a meadowlark sang its evening song. Rachel came out and stood beside him, took his hand, and they watched the darkness settle over the farm in comfortable silence. Everything Frank had built, everything he had sacrificed, everything he had believed in, now rested in their hands. It was a weight that would have crushed a lesser couple, but they had been training for this weight, separately and together, building the partnership that would carry the farm into its next chapter. The land endured, the farm persisted, and they would carry it forward, not because they inherited it, but because they had earned it, one early morning and one hard day, and one difficult choice at a time. Together, the years after Frank's death moved with the steady rhythm of seasons, each one building on the last, accumulation rather than event. Caleb turned 30, then 32, then 35, the farm growing with him, 1,800 acres now under direct management. The Gage County lease expired and the land incorporated into the Morrison operation. Rachel had proven herself not just a partner, but an equal, her engineering expertise modernizing systems that had operated on intuition and experience for generations. They employed 8 people full-time now, young farmers and agricultural students who wanted to learn sustainable practices, precision techniques, the marriage of tradition and technology that made the Morrison farm a model others studied. The equipment shed held machines worth over $2 million, GPS-guided tractors and combines and planters that could adjust seed depth and fertilizer application on the fly based on real-time soil analysis. The operation grossed $2.3 million in a good year, netted close to $700,000 after all expenses. But success brought complications that wealth alone couldn't solve. The loneliness that had defined Caleb's childhood had evolved into isolation of a different kind. He was respected in the county, even admired, but he was also apart. The farm kid who had inherited millions, while others struggled to keep their operations afloat. The young man who had been given opportunities his peers would never see. Resentment mixed with admiration in equal measures, creating a social distance that money and accomplishment only widened. His relationship with his parents remained fractured. Phone calls on birthdays and holidays that lasted 5 minutes and said nothing of substance. David had never forgiven the inheritance distribution, saw it as theft disguised as legacy, refused to acknowledge that Caleb had earned what he received. Margaret tried to maintain connection, but she didn't understand farming, didn't understand why anyone would choose this life when other options existed. Their conversations circled the same territory endlessly, mutual incomprehension disguised as concern. Only Lily made effort to bridge the gap. She visited twice a year, bringing her marketing expertise to help Caleb develop direct-to-consumer sales channels, creating a website and social media presence that told the farm's story to urban customers willing to pay premium prices for sustainably grown food. She never asked about the inheritance, never showed resentment about being excluded. Instead, she built her own success, became a partner in a Chicago marketing firm, made a life that fit her talents the way farming fit Caleb's. On a Sunday afternoon in early spring when Caleb was 36, Lily called with news that carried weight beyond the words themselves. Dad's sick, cancer, they caught it late. How late? Stage 4 pancreatic, maybe 6 months. He wanted you to know. Caleb sat down heavily, the phone pressed to his ear, processing information that felt simultaneously shocking and inevitable. David Morrison was 70, had lived hard and fast, too much stress and too little sleep, and decades of resentment eating him from inside. 6 months. The same timeline Doc Miller had given Frank, though Frank had lasted longer through stubbornness and spite. Does he want to see me? Lily was quiet for a moment. I think he does. But he doesn't know how to ask. Pride, and guilt maybe, for how things went. Tell him I'll come. Next weekend, I'll bring Rachel. The drive to Chicago took 8 hours, crossing the width of Iowa and entering Illinois through farmland that gradually gave way to suburbs and then city. The landscape transforming from horizontal to vertical, fields replaced by buildings, sky shrunk to narrow strips between skyscrapers. Caleb had been to Chicago exactly 3 times in his life, hated it each time. The crowds and noise, and the particular kind of loneliness that came from being surrounded by millions of strangers who shared nothing of your experience or values. David and Margaret lived in a condo on the 43rd floor of a building that cost more than most farms. The view was spectacular, Lake Michigan stretching to the horizon, the city spread below like something from a different planet. Inside, the space was modern and minimal, glass and steel and art that Caleb didn't understand. No photographs or personal items, or anything that suggested humans actually lived there. His father looked smaller than Caleb remembered, diminished by disease and treatment, his skin gray and his eyes hollow. They shook hands formally, the gesture awkward and insufficient. Margaret hugged Caleb too tightly, held on too long, her own fear evident in the desperation of the embrace. They sat in the living room with its impossible view and drank coffee and talked about nothing important for 30 minutes, circling the real conversation the way animals circle a water source where predators wait. Finally, David set down his cup and looked at Caleb directly for the first time. Your grandfather was right about you. I didn't want to admit it, but he was. You were built for that life in a way I never was. The acknowledgement after 28 years carried the weight of confession. Caleb felt something shift in his chest, some long-held tension beginning to release. I tried farming for 1 summer when I was 18, David continued. Hated every minute of it. The early mornings, the physical labor, the complete dependence on factors beyond your control. It felt like punishment. So I left, went to college, studied architecture, built a life where I controlled the variables. And I resented my father for making me feel like a failure for choosing differently. You weren't a failure, you were just different. He never said that, never acknowledged that not everyone is suited for farming. He acted like I was abandoning something sacred. And then he took you, my son, and turned you into the farmer I refused to be. Part of me was relieved. Part of me was furious. I'm sorry you felt that way. Don't apologize. David's voice carried unexpected force. You have nothing to apologize for. I'm the one who should apologize. For resenting your success. For seeing Frank's will as favoritism instead of recognition of your work. For not being the father you deserved. The silence that followed stretched long and uncomfortable. Rachel reached over and took Caleb's hand, grounding him. Outside the window, Chicago continued its endless motion, indifferent to the small human reconciliation happening 43 floors above the street. I read his journals, Caleb said finally. Grandpa's. 20 years of daily entries about my work, my progress, my growth. He was building a case, I think, documenting why I deserved the inheritance, making sure no one could claim it was arbitrary or unfair. Margaret spoke for the first time. May I see them, the journals? I'd like to understand what Frank saw in you, what I was too far away to see myself. I'll bring them next time I visit. David leaned forward, his hands shaking slightly from disease or medication. There's something I need you to understand. When your mother and I divorced, when Frank asked to take you, I said yes because I thought I was doing what was best for you. The city was chaos. We were both working too much. Lily was young and needed attention. You seemed to love the farm. It felt like the right choice. Was it? The question came out harder than Caleb intended. I don't know. You turned out well. Strong, successful, grounded in ways most people never achieve. But you also grew up without a father. I wasn't there for birthdays or baseball games or any of the normal things fathers and sons do together. That wasn't Frank's fault. That was mine. Caleb thought about the past 28 years, the shape his life had taken because of decisions made when he was 8 years old. The work and the loneliness and the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful. The calloused hands in the early mornings and the connection to land that most people would never understand. I needed what Grandpa gave me more than I needed a normal childhood, Caleb said. I don't know if that makes the choice right, but it makes it understandable. And I'm not angry anymore. I was for a long time. But anger takes energy, and I'd rather use mine for something productive. David nodded slowly. That's very like you. Very like Frank, too. Practical. Focused on what matters instead of what doesn't. They talked for another hour, filling in gaps, sharing stories, building bridges that should have been constructed decades ago. When Caleb and Rachel finally left, promising to visit again soon, the reconciliation felt incomplete but genuine, a beginning rather than a conclusion. David Morrison died 4 months later, exactly 1 month short of the doctor's original estimate. Caleb flew to Chicago for the funeral, sat in a church full of architects and colleagues and friends from a life he had never been part of. The eulogies spoke of David's professional accomplishments, his design work, his mentorship of young architects. No one mentioned the farm, or Frank, or the son who had chosen a different path. At the burial, Margaret pulled Caleb aside. Your father left you something. Not money, he knew you didn't need that. But he wrote you a letter, asked me to give it to you after he was gone. She handed him an envelope, expensive paper, David's architectural precision evident in the way his name was written on the front. Caleb slipped it into his jacket pocket, waited until he was back in Nebraska, sitting on the porch of the farmhouse with Rachel beside him, before he opened it. Caleb, the letter began in his father's careful handwriting. By the time you read this, I'll be gone, and these words will be all I can give you by way of explanation and apology. I spent most of my adult life believing I was right and my father was wrong, that leaving the farm was an act of courage rather than escape. But watching you succeed where I failed has taught me that rightness isn't universal. What was wrong for me was right for you. I'm proud of what you've built, not just the acreage or the income, but the life itself. You found your purpose at 8 years old and never deviated from it. That kind of certainty is rare. I searched for 40 years before finding something that felt remotely like calling, and even then it was more career than vocation. You had vocation from the beginning. I'm sorry I wasn't there. Sorry I let resentment prevent me from being the father you deserved. Sorry I couldn't see past my own failures to recognize your successes. Frank was right to leave you everything. You earned it in ways that go beyond work or dedication. You earned it by becoming exactly who you were meant to be. Take care of that land. Pass it on better than you found it. And if you have children someday, give them the gift Frank gave you, the chance to discover who they really are, regardless of what you think they should be. That's the only inheritance that really matters. Your father, David Morrison. Caleb read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in the metal box with Frank's journals. 2 generations of Morrison men trying to explain themselves across the distance of death. The reconciliation had come late, but it had come. That was enough. Margaret moved to Lincoln after David died, bought a small house 10 minutes from the farm, began showing up on Sundays with casseroles and questions about how things worked, genuinely trying to understand the world her son inhabited. She was 72 years old and learning a new language, agriculture and livestock, and crop rotation. Subjects that had meant nothing to her for decades, suddenly mattering because they mattered to Caleb. Lily visited more frequently, sometimes bringing clients who wanted to tour a working farm, to see where food came from, to understand the connection between soil and table. She turned the Morrison farm into a case study for authentic agricultural marketing, writing articles and giving presentations about family farming in the 21st century. The irony that she had been excluded from the inheritance but became its most effective advocate was not lost on anyone. On a Saturday morning in late summer, when Caleb was 37 years old, the 10-year restriction on selling land officially expired. He received a certified letter from Thompson and Associates confirming that he now held the land without conditions, free to sell or transfer or develop as he saw fit. That same day, he received 3 offers from investment groups willing to pay far above market value for the 1,800 acres of prime Nebraska farmland. Rachel found him that evening sitting on the porch with the offers spread on his lap, looking out over fields that were 2 weeks from harvest, the corn tall and healthy, the soybeans thick and green. "Are you considering any of them?" she asked. "No, not even for a second?" Caleb looked at her, this woman who had chosen to build a life with him, knowing it meant early mornings and hard work in a kind of isolation that most people would find unbearable. "Not even for a second. This land chose me. I'm not unchoosing it because a number on a piece of paper got bigger." "Good." She sat down beside him, took his hand. "Because I have news that makes keeping the land even more important." "What news?" "I'm pregnant." The words took a moment to register. They had been trying for 2 years, had begun to accept that children might not be part of their story. And now this, new life beginning just as the restrictions ended, as if the universe had been waiting for the right moment. "How long have you known?" 3 days. "Wanted to be sure before I told you. Doctor confirmed it this morning." Caleb pulled her close, held her tight, felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of legacy and purpose. The farm had always been about the future, about building something that would outlast him. But it had been abstract future, theoretical descendants. Now it was real. A child who would walk these fields, learn these lessons, carry this forward. They named him Frank, of course. Born in early spring, a healthy 8-pound boy who cried lustily and nursed well and seemed entirely unimpressed by the inheritance he represented. Caleb held his son for the first time in the same farmhouse where he had grown up, in the bedroom where he had spent those first lonely nights 29 years ago, and he understood finally what his grandfather had been building toward. Not just a farm, not just financial security, but continuity. The unbroken chain of people who loved this land, who understood its value beyond dollars, who would tend it and protect it and pass it on. Frank had given Caleb that gift. Now Caleb could give it to his son. The boy grew quickly, alert and curious, crawling by 6 months, walking by 10. By his 2nd birthday, he was following Caleb around the farm, wanting to help with everything, his small hands trying to grasp tools too large for him, his determination and stubbornness already evident. Caleb saw himself in the boy, saw Frank too, the same single-minded focus, the same need to be useful. On Frank Jr.'s 3rd birthday, Caleb took him to the old machine shed where the 1952 Farmall Cubs still sat, maintained but rarely used now that they had modern equipment. The tractor was the same one Caleb had learned to drive on, the same one his father had learned on before him. 3 generations connected by a simple machine. "Want to drive it?" Caleb asked. The boy's eyes went wide. "I'm big enough?" "Almost. We'll practice first, just like my grandpa taught me." He lifted Frank Jr. onto the seat, stood behind him, guided small hands to the steering wheel, and explained the controls in simple terms. The engine, cold-started after months of sitting idle, coughed twice and settled into its familiar rhythm. They drove in circles around the machine shed yard, Caleb controlling the pedals while his son steered, the boy's laughter pure and joyous. Margaret watched from the farmhouse porch, tears running down her face. Later, she told Caleb it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen, the continuation of something she had never fully understood, but now recognized as sacred. Lily visited that summer with her own news. She was engaged to a man who worked in agricultural policy, someone who understood farms not through living on them, but through studying their economic and environmental impact. They planned to marry in the fall, and she wanted the wedding on the farm, in the machine shed, with the equipment pushed to the sides and the concrete floor cleaned and decorated. Caleb said yes immediately, honored that his sister wanted to anchor her future to this place, even if she would never live here. The wedding was beautiful in its simplicity. 50 people gathered in a working space, surrounded by the tools of farming, celebrating a union that connected urban and rural, policy and practice, the theoretical and the real. During the reception, Lily pulled Caleb aside. "I need to tell you something. About Grandpa Frank. Something I've been carrying for a long time." "Okay." "When I was in college, maybe 19 or 20, he called me, asked if I resented him for leaving everything to you. I told him no, that I understood, that you had earned it and I had chosen a different path. He told me he appreciated that, Then he asked if I would do him a favor. What favor? He asked me not to tell you we had talked. Said he wanted you to discover your own worth without knowing that I'd already acknowledged it. Said the uncertainty would make you stronger. She paused, watching Frank Jr. chase chickens in the yard. I'm telling you now because I think you've proven him right. You didn't need validation from me or anyone else. You built this based on your own vision and work. Did he say anything else? Just that he was proud of both of us. That we'd each found our place in the world, and that was what mattered. Success looks different for different people, and he was glad we both figured that out. Caleb felt the final piece of his grandfather's plan click into place. Frank had been manipulating from the grave in the gentlest way possible, orchestrating not just an inheritance but a family's understanding of itself. The old man had played a game with a timeline measured in decades, moving pieces with patience most people couldn't imagine. The years continued their steady progression. Frank Jr. turned 5, then 7, then 8, the same age Caleb had been when he arrived at the farm. The boy was different in many ways, had both parents, had stability, had never been abandoned or left behind. But the land called to him the same way it had called to Caleb, a connection that transcended circumstance or explanation. On a morning in early autumn when Frank Jr. was 8 years old, Caleb woke him before dawn and took him to the barn for morning chores. The boy had done this hundreds of times, but today felt different, weighted with meaning. Caleb couldn't quite articulate. They fed the cattle together, moved hay bales, checked water levels, the work familiar and comfortable. When they finished, Caleb drove them to the hill on the north edge of the property, the highest point on the farm, the place where you could see all 1,800 acres spread out in every direction. The sun was just rising, painting the cornfields gold, the soybeans deep green, the pastures where cattle grazed in the morning mist. Caleb knelt down so he was eye level with his son. You know this farm will be yours someday, right? Frank Jr. nodded seriously. When you're old, like great-grandpa Frank was. Maybe before that, but whenever it happens, I need you to understand something. This land isn't just property. It's not something you own to make money from. It's a responsibility, a trust. Your job is to take care of it and make it better and pass it on to your children better than you found it. The boy looked out over the fields, his young face serious. What if I don't want it? What if I want to do something else? Caleb felt an echo of the conversation he had with Frank so many years ago. Then you do something else, no judgment. This life isn't for everyone. But I think you already know whether it's for you or not. I think it is. Frank Jr. spoke with a certainty beyond his years. I like it here. I like the work. I like knowing what needs doing every day. That's exactly how I felt when I was your age. Caleb stood, put his hand on his son's shoulder. But you've got time to figure it out. No rush. The land will wait. They drove back to the farmhouse where Rachel had breakfast ready, where Margaret sat with her morning coffee, reading the agricultural reports she had taught herself to understand, where life continued in its steady rhythm. The cycle of seasons and planting and harvest and renewal. The endless work of farming that defeated some people and completed others. That night, after Frank Jr. was asleep, Caleb sat in the farm office with the metal box open on the desk, reading through his grandfather's journals for perhaps the 100th time. The entries were familiar now, but they still carried power, still validated choices made decades ago. He picked up a pen and opened a new journal, a leather-bound book identical to the ones Frank had kept, and began to write. August 15, 2025. Frank Jr. asked me today what happens when I'm gone. Told him the same thing my grandfather told me, that the land chooses its people. I think it's already chosen him. He's 8 years old and he understands the weight of this place in a way that can't be taught. He has it in him, the same thing Frank saw in me, the willingness to work, the capacity to love something more than himself, the patience to build across decades rather than demanding immediate results. Rachel is pregnant again, due in March. A daughter this time if the ultrasound is right. Don't know if she'll want this life, but we'll give her the same choice Frank gave me, the chance to discover who she really is. The farm is doing well, 1,800 acres producing strong, net worth around $12 million now if you count land value at current prices. But the numbers don't matter as much as the continuity. 4 generations of Morrison farmers on this land, Frank who built it, me who maintained and expanded it, Frank Jr. who will carry it forward, and his children after him if they choose. I understand now what my grandfather was building. Not just a successful farm, but a legacy of work and stewardship. A family defined not by blood alone, but by shared commitment to something larger than ourselves. He gave me this gift when I was 8 years old and didn't know enough to appreciate it. Now I'm giving it to my son. The cycle continues. Caleb set down the pen, closed the journal, placed it in the box with Frank's 20 volumes. Someday when Frank Jr. was older, he would read these entries, would understand the thought and care that had gone into preparing him for this responsibility, would know that every decision, every lesson, every moment of patience had been building toward his future. Outside the office window, the Nebraska night was clear and cool, stars visible in their thousands the way they never were in cities. The corn rustled in a gentle breeze. Cattle lowed softly in the barn. A coyote called somewhere distant. The farm continued its endless work even in darkness, growing and living and preparing for tomorrow. Caleb Morrison, 38 years old, father of one soon-to-be two, heir to 1,800 acres and a legacy of hard work, sat in the same office where his grandfather had sat planning this future. He thought about the 8-year-old boy who had felt abandoned on a gravel driveway, who had cried himself to sleep in an attic room, who had believed he wasn't wanted. That boy had been wrong about almost everything. He hadn't been abandoned. He had been chosen. He hadn't been unwanted. He had been needed. The farm had needed him, and he had needed the farm, and Frank had understood that when no one else did. The old man had looked at a frightened child and seen a future farmer, had wagered everything on that vision, had won. The land that chose me, Caleb thought, looking out over the dark fields. The phrase had become his mantra, his explanation for the path his life had taken. But it was more than that. It was truth. The land had needed someone who would love it without reservation, who would work without complaint, who would sacrifice comfort for meaning. And somehow, impossibly, it had found him. Or maybe Frank had found him, and the land had simply agreed. Either way, the result was the same: a life of purpose, a legacy of stewardship, a family built on work and land and the unbreakable bond between them. Caleb turned off the office light and walked through the dark farmhouse, checking locks, turning off lights, the nightly routine. He looked in on Frank Jr., sleeping peacefully in the same attic room where Caleb had spent those first lonely nights. The boy's face was peaceful, innocent of the weight that would someday rest on his shoulders. But he would be ready for it. Caleb would make sure of that, the same way Frank had made sure of him. He climbed into bed beside Rachel, her hand finding his in the darkness, their second child moving in her belly. The future assembling itself one heartbeat at a time. Outside, the farm waited for morning, for work, for the continuation of everything that had come before. The land endured, the legacy persisted, and Caleb Morrison, grandson of Frank, father of Frank Jr., steward of 1,800 acres of Nebraska prairie, closed his eyes and slept the sleep of someone who knew exactly who he was and why he was here. The sleep of someone who had been given the greatest gift possible and had spent a lifetime proving himself worthy of it. The land had chosen well.